In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3 mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, great, we'll see you when you get back. So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail, so it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. But she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods, and even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can, and as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her, and she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization, or she could take a shortcut. Because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road, but she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks up the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. and she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but she couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent. She zips it up and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn. She doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low, audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point, she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. Two days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him. She was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out. And besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up. That she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again. Based on that big clue, here is the leading theory about what happened to Homer and Langley Collier. Back on March 9th, 1947, so the night that Langley had snuck out the front door in the middle of the night with his shabby clothes on and headed to Brooklyn where he went dumpster diving, well, he wasn't just dumpster diving to find new treasures to bring back to the mansion to stuff inside. Instead, he was actually looking for something really specific for his brother. He was looking for oranges, like the fruit. And this particular dumpster in Brooklyn was right behind a store that sold fruit, and so there were always lots of oranges in this dumpster. Langley was actually trying his very best to take care of his older brother Homer. He had actually begun doing research using his father's old medical textbooks to try to find a cure for Homer's blindness caused by his stroke. And at some point, Langley believed he really had come across the cure. And the cure was basically for Homer to eat oranges. Lots and lots of oranges. And in fact, over the last several weeks before this night, Langley had already made this change in Homer's diet. He only fed him oranges for every single meal. He got them from this dumpster, and he fed them to Homer. And Homer, he too believed this cure was going to work, and so he ate the oranges without question. And so back on March 9th, after Langley had gathered up the oranges from inside this dumpster, slung it on his shoulder, and walked back to his mansion, he maneuvered his way through the crack in the front door because he was super skinny. He was able to barely get through. And then once he was inside the mansion and shut the door behind him, he maneuvered his way up to the second floor. And then he began the most dangerous part of his journey from one side of the second floor to the other where Homer was. Basically, Langley needed to crawl through a 2-foot wide tunnel he had built through all the junk and trash, but it was lined with booby traps. In particular, there was a nasty trap at the end of the tunnel where there was this stack of metal boxes filled with all these newspapers. They were really heavy, and they were positioned so if you even so much as barely touched the lowest box, they would come crashing down on you. Now, Langley had made this journey countless times. This is how he went to see his brother every single day as he went through this tunnel. But on this day, as he low-crawled his way through the tight tunnel in the trash, he accidentally knocked the lowest metal box. The boxes tumbled down on him and pinned him to the ground. Now, these boxes were very heavy, but they were not heavy enough to kill someone. It would just pin them down. It would be impossible to get out from under them. And so Langley, very likely, after getting trapped, called out for his brother, Homer, who was actually only 10 feet away from him. But Homer was blind, he was sick, he had absolutely no energy because all he ate was oranges and it was basically killing him. And so he couldn't even get out of his chair, let alone go save his brother. And so for several agonizing hours, Langley likely yelled for his brother until the weight of all these boxes did crush him to death. And then Homer was left all alone in this house where no one knew he needed help and no one could even get to him if they wanted to. And so he was doomed. And so for 2 weeks, Homer just sat in this chair, starving to death, while he likely listened to the sound of rats eating his brother's body. The big clue that the police found that broke this case wide open is they actually spotted Langley's white foot bone that had been picked clean by the rats jutting up out of this trash tunnel 10 feet away from Homer. When the police had first searched the mansion, it was so full of stuff that they never saw this bone. It just kind of blended in. But 18 days after finding Homer, they realized Langley was right there. There was a skeleton. As for the Charles Smith tipster that police thought had to be Langley calling in after he had murdered his brother, well, it wasn't Langley because Langley was dead at the time this tip came in. And so Charles Smith was a real person who very likely just walked past the mansion and he probably caught a whiff of the smell of rotting dead bodies, and so he called it in. 4 months after Homer and Langley were found dead inside of their maze of trash, their mansion was declared a fire hazard and demolished. Today, there is a small park called the Collier Brothers Park, and it's filled with nothing but a couple of trees and a bench. On June 7, 2007, 48-year-old Bob Idman sat at his desk across from a client at the small auto insurance company he owned in St. Charles, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. Bob and his client talked like they were old friends. That was how Bob was with all of his clients. Part of the reason for this was that Bob just loved talking to people. But he also knew that a lot of his clients came to him when they had no other option. And they were often stressed out about making car insurance payments, so he tried hard to put them at ease. Bob went out of his way to work with people who had bad credit, or a history of traffic violations, or maybe who had gotten a DUI. These were people who desperately needed auto insurance because without it they couldn't drive, but they simply couldn't get insured by larger companies. Bob was well aware of this and made sure he never ever took advantage of these people's desperation. Instead, he offered affordable rates, accepted cash payments, and worked with clients to come up with insurance plans that they could actually handle. And so because of this, Bob had gotten a reputation in town as being as much a benefactor as he was a businessman. In the office, Bob's client handed him an envelope of cash to cover her payment for the month. They talked a bit longer, and then the client left. Once the door was closed, Bob marked the payment in his books, opened a desk drawer where he kept his cash hidden, and tucked the money inside. After that, he looked down at his phone and realized it was later than he thought. So he quickly grabbed a stack of business cards off his desk, slipped them in his pocket, and walked out. Bob's office was on the second floor of a strip mall. So once he was outside, he walked right down the steps to the parking lot, got in his car, and pulled out onto the street. Even though St. Charles was only about 30 minutes from the major city of St. Louis, it felt like a small town. This was a place where a lot of residents kept their doors unlocked and even left their keys in their cars. As Bob drove, he saw loads of people outside enjoying the beautiful spring weather and walking along the Missouri River that wound its way through St. Charles. Bob was a member of the St. Charles Chamber of Commerce, so he loved seeing people taking advantage of the natural beauty the town had to offer. And as an active member of the community, he really believed this was the kind of place where someone could help others and still succeed in business. A few minutes later, Bob pulled into the parking lot of a car dealership in town, and when he did, he got a huge smile on his face, because he saw his wife Diane standing outside the showroom waiting for him. So Bob parked his car, hopped outside, and walked right over to his wife and gave her a kiss on the cheek. The two had been married for 28 years, but they'd only started working together about a year ago when Bob opened up his insurance business. And people who knew them thought they complemented each other perfectly. Bob was this big guy with messy gray hair who loved to talk, while Diane looked and acted like a total professional. And even though they went about things differently, they shared a drive and an appreciation for hard work. In fact, Diane had a full-time job at a hospital, but she still managed to carve out a few hours almost every day to help her husband in his office or to do some marketing for the insurance company, which is actually why they were there at the car dealership. Bob handed Diane half of the business cards he'd brought, and then the two of them split up and began talking to everyone at the dealership who might be looking for a new car. This was one of the ways they marketed Bob's company and found new clients. The two of them spent the rest of the day handing out cards and talking to people. By the time they were finished, they were worn out, but they felt like they'd put in a good, honest day of work. That night, back at home, Bob stayed up and brainstormed more possible marketing ideas, while Diane went to bed early. She had to be up and out of the house by 5 a.m. the next day to make her shift at the hospital. Bob knew how hard it had been for Diane, working basically non-stop across multiple jobs, but he told himself this would all be worth it. The risk he had taken by opening up his own business would eventually pay off, he knew it. Then he'd be able to give Diane a happier, easier life. At 10 a.m. the following day, June 8th, Bob walked into his office, went to his desk, and got right to work, going over his financial statements and planning client meetings. And he'd been working for about an hour when he heard the office door open. So he stopped what he was doing, and he looked up from his desk. At 12:30 p.m., so 2.5 hours after Bob had gotten to the office, a postal worker was making her daily rounds through the same strip mall. She delivered mail to all the businesses on the first floor and then headed upstairs to drop a package off for Bob. She opened Bob's door, said hello as she walked in, and then stopped cold right inside the doorway. She began to scream, dropped the package on the ground, and ran back down the stairs, yelling for help. People began coming out of their shops and offices to see what was going on. At the same time, this postal worker just happened to spot a police cruiser coming down the street towards the strip mall, so she sprinted across the parking lot and ran out into the road, shouting and waving her arms to get their attention. The police cruiser came to a screeching halt, and an officer got out and asked her what was wrong. And the postal worker, who could barely breathe, began to describe what she had just seen. A moment later, that same police officer was entering Bob's office, and just like the postal worker had done, the officer froze in the office doorway. He had been on the force for years, but what he saw in the office still hit him hard. Because on the floor right in front of him, Bob lay motionless, surrounded by a pool of blood. The officer quickly pulled himself together, ran across the office, and crouched down over Bob's body. He checked for a pulse, but it was clear Bob was dead. Not long after the officer contacted the station to report the death, Detective Donald Stepp of the St. Charles Police and his superior, Captain Pat McCarrick, arrived at the scene. These were two of the most experienced investigators on the force, but even they had not had to deal with many homicides in St. Charles. Because, at the time, the city had a far lower murder rate than the state of Missouri and the country as a whole. Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick did a walkthrough of the office, and then they examined Bob's body. They saw multiple bullet wounds, but one of the shots looked like it had just grazed Bob. Stepp and McCarrick also found spent shell casings and also live rounds from a 9mm handgun spread out at different spots across the floor. Because of these live rounds on the floor, which are just unshot bullets, so intact, full live rounds, the investigators thought the killer's weapon might have jammed at some point, and so maybe in an attempt to clear the jam, they had ejected these live rounds onto the ground. Or perhaps the killer might have just been an inexperienced shooter and sort of unintentionally ejected these live rounds without shooting them. The investigators dug through Bob's desk, and they noticed there was no sign of a wallet or any form of ID. They checked Bob's pockets and didn't find a wallet there either, so they thought maybe this had been a robbery. But not long after that, they discovered the money in Bob's cash drawer. They didn't know why a robber would have taken Bob's wallet and left all this cash behind. But maybe there was a chance that the killer was not only an inexperienced shooter, but also an inexperienced thief. Soon, the investigators were joined by members of the county forensic team. Forensics officers examined and collected the shell casings as well as the live rounds. They dusted for prints and did a thorough search of Bob's body and clothes for possible DNA samples. While the forensics team worked in the office, Stepp and McCarrick made their way outside and began questioning owners and employees from the other businesses in the strip mall. The woman who owned the printing shop right below Bob's office proved to be the most helpful. She told investigators she had seen Bob pull into the parking lot around 10 a.m. And at about 11, she said she'd heard loud banging coming from upstairs in Bob's office. She said that she figured Bob was just moving file cabinets around or something, and as a joke, she'd even yelled up to him from her office, "Hey Bob, keep the noise down." But now that she knew what had really happened to Bob, she wished at the time she heard those noises, she had gone upstairs to check on him. The investigators asked her if she could think of anyone who might have had an issue with Bob, but the woman said no. Bob was one of the most likable people she knew, and she figured everyone the police would talk to would say the same thing, because that's just who Bob was. A few minutes later, as the investigators walked out of the print shop, Detective Stepp scanned the strip mall. and the front door of a Mexican restaurant caught his attention. Positioned right above the restaurant door was a security camera that pointed out towards the parking lot and the street. So the investigators went inside the restaurant and asked the owner if they could have his surveillance footage from that morning and also the night before. The owner said of course, and handed over the footage. By the time the investigators had spoken to everyone in the strip mall, it was about 3 p.m. Around that time, Stepp and McCarrick headed towards the stairs to rejoin the forensics team inside of Bob's office. But as they were walking, they heard an officer shouting their names from the parking lot. They turned around and saw the officer standing there with a woman, and as they made eye contact with this officer, he quickly came over to them. He said the woman he was with was Bob's wife, Diane. She'd been trying to get a hold of Bob, but he never answered, so she came up here to see if everything was okay. He said Diane obviously knew something was going on here because of the police presence, but she didn't actually know what had happened to Bob. Detective Stepp took a breath, and then he and his captain went to go speak with Diane. They introduced themselves, and then Stepp broke the news that her husband had been found dead in his office, and that someone had shot him. Then Stepp and McCarrick offered their condolences. But Diane's response took them completely by surprise. Diane barely reacted at all, and she didn't even say anything. Now, the investigators knew that people handled news like this in very different ways, but neither of them had ever seen something like this. It was like Diane was completely devoid of emotion. Stepp and McCarrick shared a quick look, and it was clear they both thought this was strange. But they were experienced enough not to jump to conclusions based on a single reaction or non-reaction from somebody who just heard such terrible news. Stepp broke the silence and told Diane they'd like to ask her some questions so they could try to figure out, where to start this investigation. Diane finally spoke and said she would help if she could. Stepp called over to the officer who had brought them Diane and asked him to go get them a chair. The officer ducked into one of the offices and quickly came back out again with a metal folding chair and placed it down next to Diane. Diane took a seat right there in the parking lot, and then Stepp and McCarrick began questioning her. As the victim's spouse, Diane was automatically a person of interest. So the investigators started with basic questions about her and Bob's marriage. How was their marriage going lately? Did they fight? Did they have financial problems? But Diane said she and Bob had a great relationship. They fought like any married couple would, but it was nothing serious. She said financially they were fine. And with Bob's growing business, they actually hoped to be in even better shape financially soon. Without missing a beat, Captain McCarrick asked if Bob had a life insurance policy, and if so, was Diane the beneficiary? This was a pretty standard question in this situation when dealing with a victim's spouse or children, because somebody killing a family member to collect the life insurance policy was definitely not unheard of. Diane said yes, Bob had life insurance, and she was the beneficiary, but it was a small policy. The payout was maybe $5,000. Now, immediately, neither of the investigators thought that was enough money for somebody to want to kill over, but they didn't want to rule anything out yet. At some point, Detective Stepp asked Diane if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Bob, and he sort of expected her answer to be similar to the one the print shop owner had given. But Diane's answer was very different. She said she did know somebody. There was a man who might have it out for Bob. She said his name was Kevin Green, and he was a rival auto insurance salesman in town. Bob had recently accused Kevin of stealing one of his clients and had actually gone to Kevin's office to confront him about it. After jotting down Kevin's name, Stepp asked Diane one more question. Did Bob usually carry cash on him? Diane nodded. She said he always had a good amount of cash in his wallet, and he always carried his wallet in his back pocket, even when he was sitting at his desk. After speaking to Diane, Stepp and McCarrick returned to Bob's office, where forensics officers were still working. Bob's missing wallet meant that his murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad, like they'd thought. And so they shared the information about Bob always carrying his wallet in his back pocket with the forensics team. After hearing this, one of the forensics officers walked over to Bob's body, crouched down, and studied the back pocket of his pants. She said she would cut away the pocket from the pants and keep it as a potential source for a DNA sample. Upon hearing this, Stepp and McCarrick looked confused. DNA samples could only be taken from bodily fluids, and unless they were missing something, it did not look like the pocket had any fluids on it. The forensics officer saw their looks and told them that this was sort of a long shot, but DNA testing technology was making huge advances very quickly. So maybe, down the line, they might be able to pull something useful from that back pocket, despite there not being any obvious fluids on it. Now, Stepp and McCarrick would love it if that wound up being the case, but there was obviously no way they could count on that. So, in the meantime, they decided to start with the one person Bob might have had a beef with, Kevin Green, the rival insurance salesman. Several hours after Bob's body had been discovered, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick walked into another small auto insurance office in St. Charles. And there, they found Kevin Green working at his desk. Kevin smiled warmly and then asked how he could help, almost like he might try to sell them something. But when they told him that Bob Idman had been murdered, Kevin's smile quickly disappeared and he looked genuinely shocked. The investigators laid out their reason for being there. They knew that Kevin and Bob were rivals and that Bob had recently confronted him about stealing clients. But Kevin just shook his head and said it was not like that at all. He and Bob did not have a confrontation. They just spoke, and there was no rivalry, at least not how the detectives were making it sound. He said that he and Bob were competitors, but they were cordial with each other and actually seemed to get along just fine. Stepp asked Kevin if he could give them a timeline of how he'd spent his day. Kevin nodded and said he'd just gone shopping that morning at a sporting goods store, and then after that, he had come into work. After taking down some notes, Stepp nodded and said they would be in touch if they needed anything else. Then the two investigators left. In the days immediately following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick got members of their team to begin to follow up on Kevin's alibi. As for the two of them, they began to focus on the theory that Bob's murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad. If that was the case, they knew they could be looking for anyone off the streets. But they hoped that the surveillance camera footage they had gotten from the Mexican restaurant would help make the search a whole lot easier. So, Stepp, McCarrick, and another member of their team began the painstaking process of sitting in a cramped office and watching the grainy video footage frame by frame. And after only doing this for a short time, everything on the screen began to look like a blur of black and white, and it was hard to even make things out clearly. But suddenly, as Stepp was staring at the monitor, he thought he saw something, and it was like he had just suddenly woken up. He told the officer they were working with to rewind the footage several minutes back. The officer did, and then all three of them leaned into the screen and watched. And this time, McCarrick and the other officer saw what Stepp had seen. The same car, a Ford Focus, drove slowly through the strip mall parking lot twice within the span of a few minutes on the day of the murder. It sort of looked like the driver was staking out the place. And the final time the car drove through the lot before disappearing from the footage was about 11 a.m. And that was right around the time the owner of the print shop had heard all that noise coming from Bob's office right above her, and just about 90 minutes before Bob's body had been discovered. Unfortunately, the car's license plates weren't visible on the footage, and so Stepp and McCarrick knew that that would make their jobs a whole lot harder. Still, they had a brand new lead here, and that was exciting. So they had members of their team compile a list of every registered Ford Focus in the county and told them to start tracking down each of the owners. They also set up roadblocks in St. Charles in the hope that the Ford Focus in question might end up at one. Stepp and McCarrick knew that finding this car from the footage could take a long time. After all, there were a lot of Ford Focuses to check, and there was no guarantee the one they wanted was registered in this county. So while the search for the Ford Focus got underway, the two investigators turned their attention back to the one suspect neither of them could get out of their minds, Bob's wife, Diane. During the week following the murder, Detective Stepp and Captain McCarrick began digging deeper into Bob's relationship with his wife. They knew that Diane's strange and sort of cold reaction to the news of her husband's death did not necessarily mean she was guilty, but they just couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about her. So they reached out to Bob's cell phone carrier to secure his phone records, and they also started looking into Bob and Diane's finances. And it didn't take them long to discover that Diane had lied to them. Stepp and McCarrick learned that the couple was not doing well financially, like Diane had suggested. Starting and operating the insurance company had put Bob in significant debt. So much debt, in fact, that he had been in jeopardy of losing his business. But that wasn't even the biggest thing that jumped out at the investigators. They got more information on Bob's life insurance. The policy Diane had told them was worth just $5,000. And they learned that in fact, Bob had 3 life insurance policies that collectively were worth a total of $400,000
and Diane would get all of it with Bob dead. On June 20th, so almost 2 weeks after the murder, Stepp and McCarrick sat across from Diane in an interview room at the St. Charles police station, and they did not waste any time skirting the issue. Stepp said they knew Diane had lied to them about her and Bob's financial situation, and perhaps even more importantly, they knew she had also lied about the amount of money she would receive from Bob's life insurance. Diane stayed calm and quiet, like she had when the investigators interviewed her the first time. She said she had lied about her and Bob's financial situation for one simple reason: she was embarrassed. This response actually didn't surprise Stepp and McCarrick. A lot of people do not feel comfortable talking about money problems, even to police conducting a very serious investigation. But Stepp didn't back off. He said Diane's response did not fully explain their issue, because it didn't explain why she'd lied about Bob's life insurance. What does that have to do with being embarrassed? But all Diane could say was she didn't realize the payout was as big as it was. Stepp and McCarrick did not quite buy it, and so they asked Diane to take a polygraph test. She agreed, and they set up the test that day, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, despite all the reasons the investigators now had to suspect Diane, they had no clear evidence actually tying her to her husband's murder. So they had to let her go. After 2 weeks of their investigation, Stepp and McCarrick believed they had several strong leads, but nothing concrete. The rival insurance agent's alibi had checked out. There was still a chance he could have hired someone to kill Bob, but it was an outside chance. On top of that, police had not gotten a hit on the Ford Focus from the surveillance footage, and they hadn't gotten anything from the DNA tests conducted on blood samples taken from the crime scene. But finally, as June came to an end, Stepp and McCarrick got a hold of Bob's detailed phone records. And those records immediately raised a red flag. Because there was one number that Bob called over and over again, and it wasn't Diane's. It was a Kansas City, Missouri number belonging to a man that neither investigators had heard of. His name was James Hall. And so Stepp contacted James and asked if he knew who Bob Idman was. And James said yes, he knew Bob very well. In fact, the two of them had been lovers.
In early 1945, during World War II, the British decided they wanted to take back Ramry Island from the Japanese. Ramry Island is a fairly large, totally flat island off the coast of Burma that was a great staging location to fly air campaigns onto the mainland. So it was a great air base. And the British had actually owned this island, but the Japanese had taken it back from them in 1942. And so here they are in 1945 looking to take it back. So on January 21st, 1945, British and Indian infantry stormed the beaches of Ramry to try to take it back. As soon as they land, they have all this naval artillery support just bombing the crap out of this airbase. It was just a matter of time before they overwhelmed the remaining Japanese. But the Japanese do not want to surrender, and instead they give up the airbase that they were on, so the British take that back, and the remaining 1,000 Japanese soldiers started retreating to the opposite end of the island, to where there was a much larger battalion of Japanese soldiers that they could meet up with. But the only issue with this particular retreat was they would have to go through 10 miles of mangrove swamp where there's poisonous spiders and insects and deep mud, making it almost impossible to move. But they're determined and they head off into the swamp. But what the Japanese were not ready for is what Ramry Island is famous for. A creature that makes poisonous snakes and spiders and insects look like child's play. And they were walking directly into its den. The British troops decided we're not going to go chasing them into the swamp. And instead what they did is they set up boats, blocking positions outside of the swamp. If any of the Japanese tried to escape, they would be there waiting. And so the only way the Japanese could get out of there would be to go to the absolute other end, 10 miles away, where their Japanese counterparts were. So that night, as the British are just kind of hanging out in their boats staring at the swamp, they start hearing screams coming from inside of this swamp, and it's Japanese soldiers. Then you hear gunfire, and then silence. And then it would start all over again, all over this huge swamp. It was just screams, gunfire, silence. Screams, gunfire, silence. And the British are watching this like, do we have troops in there? What's going on in there? What was going on in there is defined by the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest massacre of humans caused by animals. And not just any animal, saltwater crocodiles. These massive man-eating crocodiles can weigh up to 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds. They can grow to be 7 meters in length or about 23 feet in length. And National Geographic has labeled these crocodiles as the most likely to eat a human of all animals. And Ramry Island has the largest population of saltwater crocodiles in the world, and they all lived inside of this swamp that the Japanese had gone into. A lot of them were bleeding from the battle they were in, and so they were literally alerting hundreds of saltwater crocodiles to their location. Saltwater crocodiles are notorious night hunters. So what probably happened is the Japanese got inside of this mangrove. The crocodiles were immediately aware of their presence, but they waited until nighttime before they started having a feeding frenzy. And over the course of the night, a number of Japanese soldiers had jumped out the sides of the swamp, exposing themselves to the British. And so about 20 of them were captured, and they said that they were completely surrounded by these crocodiles, that everywhere you looked, there were growling, huge crocodiles eating one person, and as soon as they were done, they would just charge after you and eat you. And at the end of their retreat, when the Japanese did get to the other side of the swamp, only 500 of the 1,000 made it out the other side. And so to this day, people stay far away from Ramry Island because there are so many of these man-eating saltwater crocodiles that have no issue ripping you to shreds.
Our next story is called Set Z.
On December 6, 1941, 20-year-old U.S. Navy sailor Clifford Olds met up with a couple of his shipmates at the Monkey Bar for a night out in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The next morning, just before 8 a.m., Cliff was back on board his ship, the USS West Virginia. He was starting his workday when the Japanese launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Cliff's ship was a prime target and was quickly hit with 2 bombs, 7 torpedoes, hundreds of people are dying on board, and very quickly his ship is starting to sink. On board a Navy ship, there's all these different conditions the ship is set to depending on what you're doing, whether you're at war or you're just docked in peacetime, and all of these different conditions have very specific instructions. And one of those conditions is Condition Z. Better known as Setting Z, if the captain of a ship calls this out over the loudspeakers, every single hatch inside of that ship is shut and locked. If your ship is sinking and you say Set Z, you are sealing all of those compartments so no more water can flow into them, and you can maintain a little bit of buoyancy so you don't sink quite as fast. But if you set Z as your ship is sinking, especially if you're getting attacked and there's all these holes in your ship, there's a good chance when you seal those hatches, you're going to be sealing people inside of these rooms and they will not be able to get out again. So when that call comes out over the loudspeakers, Set Z, everybody knows to get the heck out of their compartments so that they do not get trapped inside of one of those rooms. On Cliff's ship, Set Z was called over the loudspeakers, and Cliff, along with Ron Endicott, who was 18, and Buddy Costin, who was 21, were at the bottom of the ship in the freshwater pump room, and when someone came by and shut and sealed their room, they did not see them in there. And so probably the 3 of them ran to the door and were banging on it and trying to get someone's attention, but in the chaos of the moment, that person on the other side of the door that could have opened it up again was now gone. Even though the Set Z procedure did prevent water from going into certain cabins on the West Virginia, it still would sink to the bottom of the ocean along with 17 other ships. The next day, there was a whole bunch of Marines that were on the dock right next to where the wreckage of the West Virginia was underneath the water. And as they're standing on the dock, they start hearing a banging sound. And at first, they think it's probably just a salvage team or it's some strap clanging against the side of one of these ships. But they started to notice the tapping sounds started to sound like intentional rhythms that a human might make. And it dawned on them that someone is trying to get our attention underwater. There are people trapped in the West Virginia. But when the Marines ran to their superiors and told them there are people trapped inside of the ship, we have to get them out, they broke the horrible news that there's nothing they could do for them. If they went down and began trying to cut a hole in the side of the ship so they could swim out, as soon as there's even a tiny little hole on the side of that ship, there's so much pressure that it would rush inside and fill that space almost immediately, and they wouldn't be able to cut a hole big enough, fast enough, and so cutting into the ship is going to kill them. Also, just lighting that torch presents a unique problem because there's so many chemicals in the water from all of the attacks that happened the day before, we run the risk of lighting a fire or lighting off an explosion that could take even more life. And because they were still months away from being able to raise the ship out of the water, which would save them, the decision was made that we're going to have to let them die. And so for the next 16 days, Marines and sailors were put on guard duty right next to the wreckage of the USS West Virginia, and they would listen to the tapping as they desperately tried to tell people, come down here, save us, we're alive, we're not going anywhere, please help us. And the Marines and sailors were so distressed about this. It was so horrible to listen to. They would cry and cover their ears because they wanted to save them. They're so close, but they're so far away. Finally, on Christmas Eve, the banging stopped. 6 months later, they were finally able to raise the West Virginia out of the water. And as crews were going through all the different compartments and removing bodies, they got to the freshwater pump room where Cliff, Ron, and Buddy had been. They open it up and they find 3 bodies, and they realize right away the torture these poor guys had gone through. Inside this airtight section was this locker full of food rations. They're also in the freshwater pump room, and so they just opened up the tank and they had all the fresh water they needed. But what they didn't have enough of was air. And so for 16 days, sitting in the dark at the bottom of the ocean, knowing they're not going to get out of here, they slowly suffocated. And we know they were alive for those 16 days because they had a calendar where they were marking off each of the days they were down there in red pen. This story was so distressing, the Navy decided not to share the information about what happened to those 3 to their families. It wasn't until years later the truth came out, but even today, on memorials and monuments commemorating what happened at Pearl Harbor, they are listed, Cliff, Buddy, and Ron are listed as killed in action on December 7th.
On the morning of August 16, 1942, a woman named Ida Ruby was riding her horse on a dirt path right near a beach just south of San Francisco, California. Now, during the week, Ida was a telephone operator, but it was a Sunday, so she had time off, and the way she liked to spend her time off was by riding her horse along the coastline and, looking out at the beautiful water and taking in the nature and all these unbelievable cliffs that went down to the water. I mean, this was a beautiful area, and every time Ida would go out and do this little ride around, she would bring binoculars with her. And so anytime she saw something of interest, she would stop and, use her binoculars to see what it was, like animals or things out over the water. And on this particular Sunday, Ida turned a corner, and as soon as she did, something caught her attention off to her right, out over the water. And so she stopped her horse and she turned, and she looked out, and the sea was very calm, and she could see way out just past the horizon was what looked like this black thing kind of hovering over the water. And instead of raising her binoculars right away, she just kind of squinted and looked off in the direction, and she quickly realized what it was. It was a blimp. Now, today, when we hear the word blimp, we very likely think of the Goodyear blimp that kind of sits over sporting events, with the big Goodyear logo stamped on the side of it. It's basically a big balloon with a gondola that sits underneath it for the person who's driving it and passengers. And that's actually exactly what Ida was seeing, a big oversized balloon with a gondola underneath it. But this was not a Goodyear blimp, it was a military blimp. Because this was 1942, right in the middle of World War II. And 9 months earlier, the United States had joined World War II after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And ever since then, Japanese submarines had been lurking off the coast of California, kind of all across the West Coast, out in the Pacific Ocean, and occasionally they would send torpedoes out and bomb the US mainland. And so the United States responded to this by launching this fleet of blimps that basically were able to get really low to the water, that could move really slowly, and they would basically fly all along the Pacific coastline looking for Japanese submarines. They could literally go down, and from their gondola, they could look down and actually see submarines and mark them for bombing runs or, scare them off. And so Ida, like anybody else who was living on the west coast of the United States at the time, was aware that there were blimps out over the ocean, but it was still a fairly uncommon sight. And so because of that, Ida was sort of intrigued, and so she raised her binoculars and she focused on this blimp, and she would see something that was so strange that even 80 years later, nobody can fully explain it. But to really understand why what she saw was so weird, we need to back up about 5 hours on the same day to about 6 a.m. at a military base just north of where Ida was seeing this blimp. And so at 6 a.m. at this military base, that particular blimp that Ida would later see was at this military base on the ground, and some Navy pilots and mechanics were preparing the blimp for a routine mission out over the San Francisco Bay to look for Japanese submarines. The intended path this blimp was going to take on this day was it would leave the base and the pilot would take it over the famous Golden Gate Bridge, and then it would travel 28 miles to the west to the Farallon Islands. And then from there, the pilot would go 20 miles to the north to a peninsula called Point Reyes, and then from there, the pilot would head south along the coastline all the way back to base. This whole mission profile was scheduled to take about 4 hours. The pilots for this mission were going to be a 27-year-old Navy lieutenant named Ernest Cody and a 34-year-old officer named Charles Adams. And both of them were very experienced blimp pilots. They had done missions like this many times before. This was going to be a very routine mission for them. And then also, in addition to those two pilots, there would be a Navy mechanic who would join the two pilots in case there was any malfunctions with the blimp during the mission. And so everything was going to plan with this blimp that morning. There was nothing unusual about this mission. But right as the two pilots and the mechanic were literally getting inside of the gondola to begin this mission, Lieutenant Cody looked down at the control panel inside the blimp, and he noticed the blimp was way heavier than it should have been. Now, you have to understand that the level of rigor that went into preparing these blimps for flight was really intense. I mean, they were weighing every little thing that was put inside of this blimp because it was a really important part of flying these blimps, understanding how heavy it was. And so for this to be too heavy just made no sense. And so at first, Cody and Adams began tapping on the control panel, thinking maybe the panel itself was malfunctioning, and if they hit it hard enough, the little ticker would go back to a normal weight. But despite, hitting the panel, it still showed it was too heavy. And so they flagged over the mechanic who was going to be joining them on the flight anyways. And the mechanic looked and kind of thought for a second and then realized, that day it had been very foggy. And so it was totally possible that all this extra moisture in the air had stuck to the surface of the balloon. And so collectively that had added quite a bit of weight. I mean, this is a massive balloon, a lot of surface area, a lot of water. Now, this was not some crisis. At worst, this was an inconvenience. Basically, they had to wait until this moisture kind of burned off once the sun came out, and then they could fly the blimp. But Cody and Adams, they just didn't feel like waiting. This mission was so routine, so simple, they'd done it so many times. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams decided that the easiest and fastest solution to this problem was simply to tell the mechanic who was going to come with them on this mission to not come with them. Without his weight inside of the gondola, even with this extra moisture in the blimp, it wouldn't matter. The blimp would still be light enough to fly with just the two pilots on board. The mechanic didn't care, so he hopped off, and then Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams took their seats inside the gondola, and sure enough, when they looked at the control panel, the blimp was ready to go. It was light enough. And so Lieutenant Cody fired up the blimp's engines, and just after 6 a.m. that morning, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams lifted off the ground and began their routine mission. About an hour and a half later, at 7:38 a.m., Lieutenant Cody radioed back to air control, saying that so far the patrol had been totally routine, everything was going smoothly, they hadn't seen any Japanese submarines or anything out of the ordinary. And also, Lieutenant Cody said they were positioned just east of the Farallon Islands, which meant they were exactly on course, and really everything did seem to be going exactly to plan. But 4 minutes later, Lieutenant Cody radioed back again to air control, and he said they had just spotted an oil slick down on the water. So basically, picture from their perspective, they saw that gleaming oil sitting on top of the ocean. And so at the time, this often signaled that below the surface of the water, under this oil slick, was a submarine. So this is like a telltale sign that the Japanese could be right here. So Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams told Air Control that they were going to descend in the blimp down to the water and fully investigate this oil slick, and then they'd report back. This last transmission happened at 7:50 a.m. A few minutes later, a fishing boat named the Daisy Gray was gliding slowly through the water just east of the Farallon Islands, when all of a sudden the captain, who's looking straight ahead, he turned the boat and he happened to see straight ahead of him this massive blimp, the same blimp Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were in, descending very quickly through the clouds down towards the water. And remember, this was a pretty cloudy day, and so really this blimp kind of came out of nowhere, and this fishing boat captain was very aware that anytime blimps were out over the water, that was because they were looking for enemy submarines. And this captain realized he was heading right now straight in the direction of wherever this blimp was descending towards. And so the captain looked out ahead, and he saw that big oil slick on top of the water, maybe 100 yards away from him, and so he put it together that, oh my gosh, this blimp is going to that slick. That means there's an enemy submarine basically right there. And so in a panic, the fishing boat captain called to his crew to pull in the fishing nets, and he turned the wheel as fast as he could, and he hit the accelerator, doing everything he could to get away from this blimp. Because he knew that typically what happened when a blimp came down and actually found a submarine is they sometimes dropped bombs on the submarine. I mean, this is warfare. And so the fishing boat captain is getting away as fast as he can, and as soon as he's turned around, he looked back, and he saw the blimp was now about 30 feet over the water, and someone inside the gondola was now leaning out over the side, and they dropped two things directly into the water, into that oil slick, and then seconds later, these huge plumes of smoke were coming out of the water. The person had just dropped some flares, basically marking where this submarine was. And so now the captain knew, okay, it's a submarine, and the next thing is very likely going to be a bomb, like a depth charge is going to be dropped right there. And so again, the captain's just speeding his way as fast as he can, hoping that if they do drop a bomb, it doesn't affect him and his crew. And so after making it another couple 100 feet away from this blimp, the captain again turned around, expecting to see this blimp still hovering where it was, because again, they had just dropped flares. They're preparing to do something major right there. But now, when the captain turned around, he saw the blimp was no longer hanging out over the water. The blimp was now rocketing back up into the clouds like as fast as it possibly could, and before long, the blimp was gone. It disappeared into the clouds. And there had been no bomb dropped. I mean, nothing really happened beyond marking the water, so it was like, what's going on with this blimp? Meanwhile, back at Air Control, the last thing they heard from Lieutenant Cody was, hey, we see this oil slick down below, we're going to investigate, and we'll radio back when we're done. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, they had clearly descended down to the water because that fishing boat saw it happen, but then after they rocketed back up to the clouds for some reason, they never radioed back to Air Control. And so Air Control is waiting and waiting, they're not hearing back from Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams, and finally, they began hailing the two pilots to say, hey, what's going on? You said you were going to investigate, what'd you find? What happened? But they could not get in touch with Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams. And so eventually, after enough time had passed and they still had not heard from these pilots, Air Control sent two seaplanes out to that area east of the Farallon Islands to find the blimp and make sure the blimp was okay. But when the seaplanes got out there, they couldn't find the blimp anywhere. I mean, they flew all over the place doing wider and wider circuits. There was no sign of the blimp. And when they looked down at the water in the same area where Lieutenant Cody had called out that slick and where that fishing boat had also seen the slick, well, the slick was gone, or the seaplanes just couldn't see the oil slick. But the seaplanes stayed on station in that area near the Farallon Islands for another 2 hours, just flying all over the place, kind of hoping to eventually see this blimp. And eventually they would. At about 10:30 a.m. that morning, one of the seaplanes spotted the blimp way, way high in the sky, like way higher than any blimp would ever go. It is dangerously high, and it was way off course. But when these two seaplane pilots began flying towards the blimp to get eyes on the pilots inside of this blimp, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, well, when they got close enough, the blimp just began rapidly descending, like it was trying to avoid being seen by these seaplanes. And in fact, the blimp descended so quickly that it dropped below the cloud cover, and the seaplanes, they couldn't move that quickly. They had to do a big track to turn back around and try to go lower again.
But once they got below the clouds to find this blimp, the blimp was gone. It basically had vanished. And so the seaplane pilots called back to air control and they're like, I don't know what's going on with this blimp, but it's way off course. It was way up in the sky. Now it's somewhere down below, but we can't find it. We got to get in touch with Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. There's obviously something wrong. But air control would try over and over again to get in touch with these pilots, but neither Cody nor Adams ever responded. They had just gone totally radio silent. And at the same time this chaos with this blimp is happening, Ida Ruby, the woman at the beginning of the story, was riding her horse on that dirt path near the beach just south of San Francisco, and she looked out over the water and she saw that blimp. And so Ida Ruby, she stops, she raises her binoculars, and she looks at this blimp. And after she focuses her binoculars, she realizes there's obviously something wrong with this blimp. The actual balloon portion of the blimp, which said Navy on it, had collapsed so much in the middle that you couldn't even read the word Navy. It was all crumpled together because, again, the balloon is like deflated. And also she saw that this blimp appeared to just be kind of listing as if the wind was blowing it and it was not being directed by the pilots inside. And this blimp appeared to be getting blown directly towards Ida. And so she lowered her binoculars and she looked out with her naked eye, and sure enough, this crumpled up blimp that was still afloat but clearly was not doing too well was getting closer and closer and closer to her. And as it was getting lower and lower to the ground, and she's starting to worry it's going to smash into her. But right as this blimp was about to pass basically right over her head, she raised her binoculars one more time and she got a clear look inside of the gondola where Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams would have been. Now, Ida Ruby has no idea who's supposed to be inside of this blimp and who isn't, or even what they're doing, but she definitely recalled exactly what she saw inside of that gondola, and that's the thing that has troubled everybody for so many years. Because what she saw was 3 people inside of that gondola. And if you recall, that gondola only ever contained 2 people. It was Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. But now Ida Ruby is looking up, and clear as day, there are 3 people in that gondola. Even though at no point was there 3 people. It didn't leave with 3. It didn't come down and take more people on board. It made no sense that there were 3 people inside of that gondola. Again, Ida Ruby wouldn't have known that, but when that information got passed, this was like, how could that be? And so after seeing the 3 men inside of this blimp, Ida lowered her binoculars and watched in horror as this deflated blimp drifted just above her, like practically arm's length above her, and careened over the cliffs behind her and smashed into the ground. And then seconds later, Ida began hearing sirens going off in Daly City, which was located right behind her. That was the nearest town. And so as the blimp came in for a crash landing in Daly City, it scraped across a couple of residential rooftops and hit a couple power lines before kind of coming to a stop in the middle of the street. Now, the blimp didn't explode or catch on fire or anything. It just kind of crumpled to the ground and nobody got out of it. It just kind of stopped and it was there right in the middle of the street. And very quickly, first responders rushed to this blimp because there have been so many reports of this deflated blimp looking like it was about to crash. And so they had been tracking it, and here it was. And so they ran up to this blimp. But at some point, one of the first responders ran up to the gondola itself where the door was slightly open, and they opened it up, hoping to find there would be some survivors inside. But when he looked inside of this relatively small space, there was nobody in there. And there was no sign that anybody had been in there. There was no blood or anything. It was just an empty gondola. But remember, minutes before, not even, Ida Ruby had clearly seen 3 people inside of that gondola. So to go from 3 people to none in the space of a couple hundred feet as everybody's watching this thing come into crash land in Daly City, where could they have gone? And even weirder was when they looked inside of the gondola, they discovered that basically everything was functioning perfectly fine. It was unclear how it became deflated because, again, all the controls inside of this thing were working just fine. And also, the parachutes were still inside of this gondola. If you're going to jump out, you need a parachute, but they were in here. And also the life raft, it was still inside of the gondola. It was like there was nothing wrong with the blimp. And so this whole situation made no sense. The Navy would launch an exhaustive investigation into what happened with this blimp. And the only explanation the Navy came up with was, well, it looks like Officer Adams and Lieutenant Cody just fell out of the blimp at the exact same time and they disappeared into the ocean. However, both pilots were wearing life preservers and would not have taken those off. That was like absolutely 101 for being a pilot of one of these blimps. And so they would have had these life preservers on, and even if they had fallen out and perished, they would have floated to the surface, or if they landed on land, they would have likely been found. I mean, the entire route they had been on was heavily scrutinized and searched, but the bodies were never found. And then also, the Navy could not explain how Ida Ruby clearly saw 3 people absolutely, like 100 feet away from her, inside of that gondola. Like, she had no reason to lie about that. She was just saying, yeah, I looked up, saw 3 people, saw it crash into Daly City. She didn't know there was supposed to be 2 people. Like, she was just calling what she saw. But the Navy had no explanation. And so in the years that have followed this empty blimp crash in Daly City, it's been dubbed the ghost blimp story, and loads of theories circulate about what could have happened here. Some people say that, the reason there was all that extra weight at the beginning of the mission profile at 6 a.m. was not because of moisture on the balloon, but because there had to have been maybe a stowaway somewhere in the blimp. And then after takeoff, they jumped down into the gondola, and maybe they were responsible for whatever happened to the pilots and why the blimp crashed. But it doesn't explain what happened to those 3 people. What happened to the stowaway? What happened to Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams' body? We don't know. Other theories include that maybe Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were somehow captured by the Japanese, and some other people say, maybe Cody and Adams were abducted by aliens. But as far-fetched as these theories might seem, the truth is, we really have no idea what happened on that ghost blimp.
One afternoon in mid-July 2014, 59-year-old Jack Parks and his fiancée, Carol LaPaya, walked through their neighborhood of Kennedy Township, Pennsylvania. Jack sported a black fedora, wireframe glasses, and a lopsided grin beneath a graying mustache. Carol hung on his arm, smiling at how her engagement ring sparkled in the sunlight. As they walked, they passed by several neighbors who were outside doing yard work or talking. Jack and Carol waved to each person as they passed, and everyone waved back. Their neighborhood was a close-knit, working-class community 10 miles outside of Pittsburgh, and everybody seemed to know each other. In fact, Jack even had family on this street. One of his nephews, Bradley Johnson, lived nearby. As Jack and Carol passed by Bradley's house, Jack slowed down, trying to see if Bradley was home. His nephew had mentioned wanting to talk to him in person about something serious and urgent, but Jack could see that the house was empty, so that conversation would have to wait. Which was fine, because today, Jack and Carol were on a mission. Inside of Carol's purse was a large stack of wedding invitations, and they were on their way to drop these invitations in the mail, which was huge for them, because their wedding had been an unusually long time coming. So Jack and Carol had met at a bar 25 years ago. They'd fallen for each other quickly, but Jack had dragged his feet on proposing. And then, when he had felt ready, Carol was swamped at work. Then Jack was busy. The timing was just always bad. And the longer they put marriage off, the less important it seemed. And anyways, they were in love and totally committed to each other. They didn't need a marriage license to prove that. But last February, Jack's mother had passed away. Her death had made him realize that he wasn't getting any younger, and he really wanted to marry the woman he'd loved for decades. So, a few months ago, he'd finally proposed. And ever since, their days had been consumed with wedding preparations. They had the venue, the dress, and the rings, and now it was finally time to send out the invitations. The couple came to the end of the block and stopped in front of the mailbox. Carol took the envelopes from her purse and then joked that this was their last chance to cross anyone off their invite list. Jack just laughed and said they were not cutting anyone. So Carol pushed the envelopes through the mailbox slot until only one invitation remained. Carol hesitated for a second, looking at the name on that last envelope. It was her nephew, a 22-year-old named Michael LaPaya. She and Jack had been angry at Michael this whole past year. Their broken relationship with him was a sore spot for both of them. So Jack and Carol did not have children of their own, but they'd always doted on their nieces and nephews. When the kids were younger, Jack and Carol would have them over for slumber parties where they'd stay up late watching movies and eating popcorn. And as the kids got older, they'd all stayed close, except for Michael. A few years back, Michael had started drifting away from Jack and Carol and the rest of the family and getting into lots of trouble. He joined the army, but gotten dishonorably discharged for marijuana possession, and ever since, he'd suffered from PTSD and began experimenting with harder drugs. But that was actually not what caused the rift. Jack and Carol had supported Michael, even through his struggles, until one day the previous September. During a Labor Day party that Jack and Carol had hosted, guests had seen Michael go into the couple's bedroom. And when the party was over, Carol had discovered that her expensive jewelry was missing. Jack and Carol had confronted Michael, who denied taking anything, but they hadn't believed him. They told him he was no longer welcome in their home, and things had been extremely tense between them ever since. But now, Jack and Carol were ready to make amends by inviting Michael to their wedding. So, standing on the sidewalk, Carol took a deep breath and then dropped Michael's invitation into the mailbox. And suddenly, both Jack and Carol felt a whole lot lighter. The invitations were out, and good things were ahead. Jack and Carol turned away from the mailbox and began heading back home. As they reached their driveway, Jack waved to a few men standing directly across the street, outside of a small factory called Silver Star Meats. The workers were outside in their aprons smoking, and they waved back. Jack was about to go over and talk to them when he noticed Carol's irritated expression, and so he thought better of it. Jack liked the guys from the factory, but he knew they made Carol uncomfortable. She hated that they took their smoke breaks so close to their house, and she thought their blood-stained aprons were kind of unsettling. So Jack just turned away, and then he and Carol walked up their porch steps and into their house. A few days later, on Monday, July 21st, Carol sat at her desk at work, reviewing her to-do list for the wedding. The ceremony was just 6 weeks away, and there was still a lot to figure out. But then, at 10:45 a.m., her cell phone rang. And to her surprise, it was Jack's realtor. Jack had hired this realtor to sell his mother's house after she had died, and now the realtor said some potential buyers wanted to see the house that afternoon. She wanted Jack and Carol to meet her there at 4 p.m. This was all good news, because Carol and Jack had been eager to sell that house as quickly as possible. But before hanging up, Carol asked why the realtor called her instead of calling Jack. The realtor said they did call Jack first. He just didn't answer. This seemed odd to Carol. As soon as she hung up, she tried Jack's cell phone, and it rang several times before going to voicemail. She left him a message, then hung up and called the house. And as it rang, she expected to hear Jack's voice any second, but again, the call went to voicemail. Carol just sat there, trying to ignore the sick feeling of dread in her stomach. Jack knew what a worrier she could be, so he always answered her calls. But she told herself that maybe he was in the shower, or maybe outside mowing the grass without his phone on him. He would probably call her back any minute. But the clock kept ticking, and by noon, Jack still had not called. And so Carol tried him again, but he still didn't answer. Frustrated, she dropped her phone back in her purse and just focused on her computer, trying to ignore her mounting anxiety. But by 2:30 p.m., when still Jack had not called, so now it's been 3.5 hours since that first missed call, Carol just couldn't take it anymore. So she left work and began heading straight home. 20 minutes later, Carol pulled up outside of her and Jack's house. And right away, she saw that the garage door was open and Jack's car was inside, which meant he had to be home. Carol felt relieved. She was sure Jack would explain why he had missed her calls, and better yet, they'd still be able to make their 4 p.m. appointment with their realtor. But as Carol got out of her car and started up the walkway, she saw something that made her stomach drop all over again. So Jack and Carol's front porch was enclosed by a gate, and both Jack and Carol always kept the gate closed because their dog was a runner, and they wanted to make sure he didn't get out. But now Carol saw the gate was wide open. Carol rushed through the gate to the front door and turned the knob. But even though the doorknob turned, meaning it was unlocked, the door didn't budge when she pushed on it. That's when Carol realized the deadbolt inside, which they never used, must be locked. And now her anxiety turned to actual fear. Between the deadbolt, the open gate, and Jack not answering his phone, she was certain something had to be wrong here. Carol's hands shook as she dug through her purse for the house key, then struggled to get it into the lock. Finally she did, the deadbolt turned, and the door swung open. Carol stepped inside with her heart pounding, but the house was silent and still. She took a few steps further in, and then her eyes suddenly fell on something under the coffee table inside of the living room. For a second, her brain couldn't even compute what she was looking at. But then, when it clicked, she let out a scream. Because underneath the coffee table was Jack. He was lying face down on the carpet with a pool of blood under his head. Carol rushed over to Jack and shook him, but he didn't move or make a sound. And so in a panic, she found her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, Carol shouted that there'd been some kind of horrible accident. Her fiancé must have fallen and hit his head on the coffee table. And she begged the dispatcher to please send help now. Moments later, police and first responders arrived, and they had to physically drag Carol away from Jack's side. Carol watched as they knelt beside her fiancé and checked for a pulse, but they didn't find one. Carol's world crumbled. She knew Jack was dead. A short while later, Detective Lori McKeel of the Allegheny County Homicide Unit arrived on the scene. A perimeter was already established, and the house was crawling with police. But before McKeel went in, she looked around outside. Neighbors were watching the activity from their front lawns, and McKeel noticed a specific group of people huddled together on the sidewalk, consoling a sobbing woman whose hands were covered in blood. McKeel guessed this must be the victim's partner, and the people around her were her family. But before speaking to her, the detective quickly made her way across the yard and went inside of the house. Inside, officers and forensic techs searched the front room for evidence. McKeel had already been briefed on this case, so she knew the victim's name was Jack Parks, and his fiancée had found him dead after an apparent fall. McKeel went into the living room, where Jack's body lay face up, partially underneath the coffee table. There was a lot of blood, and at first glance, a fall didn't seem out of the question. However, when she crouched down to get a better look, she found a small hole behind Jack's right ear, toward the back of his skull. It was a gunshot wound, which meant this was no accidental fall. This was a murder. McKeel stood up and told the other investigators nearby to keep their eyes peeled for bullet casings or a gun. Then she continued scanning the house. The house was lived in, but relatively neat, with boxes of what looked like wedding favors stacked in the hall. But when McKeel stepped inside of the master bedroom, she saw this room had been totally ransacked. Dressers were overturned and drawers were pulled out. Several jewelry boxes lay empty and discarded on the carpet. Either this was a robbery, or someone had staged the scene to make it look like one. As McKeel made her way back to the living room, she saw several photos of what looked like a seemingly loving couple about to get married. But McKeel's training told her not to take anything at face value. Every relationship had its problems, and a deadline like a wedding could bring tension to the surface. So before McKeel did anything else, she wanted to speak to Jack's fiancé. If there were any skeletons in the couple's closet, she needed to know about them. Later that afternoon, Detective McKeel sat with Carol in an interview room at the police station. McKeel knew that so far, nobody had told Carol much of anything, including the fact that Jack's death was a murder, not an accidental fall. And from McKeel's point of view, this was a good thing. The romantic partner was always the primary suspect in a murder. And so McKeel wanted to study how Carol behaved in their interview before she told Carol anything about the investigation. So McKeel started slowly, asking basic questions about Carol's relationship with Jack. But as Carol calmed down and opened up, McKeel began to probe deeper. She asked if either Carol or Jack was getting cold feet about their wedding. And why did it take them so long to get engaged? Were there suspicions of infidelity? What about money problems? McKeel watched Carol for any hint of defensive or anger. But while Carol did deny having any problems with Jack, she didn't seem mad at being asked about it. She just seemed confused. So, McKeel decided to ask a question that she knew would increase the pressure, by making it obvious that Carol was now a suspect in a murder. The detective looked into Carol's eyes and asked her if she owned a gun. And at this, Carol froze. After a second, she asked why she was being questioned about a gun when her fiancé had fallen. McKeel stayed quiet and watched as Carol's expression changed from confusion to understanding. Carol just looked at McKeel and said, "Are you saying Jack was shot?" And then Carol just began sobbing. Even though McKeel could not officially rule Carol out as a suspect yet, she did think Carol's reaction to this was very genuine. So McKeel handed Carol a box of tissues and asked in a gentle voice if Jack had any enemies. Through tears, Carol said no. In fact, if anything, Jack was sometimes too friendly. Recently, Carol said she'd come home to find Jack hanging out in the living room with one of the workers from the factory across the street. Carol said she'd been mad at him for letting a stranger inside of their home. And then after that, Carol just broke into more sobs. McKeel narrowed her eyes as she thought back to Jack and Carol's ransacked bedroom. Crime scene techs were still processing the scene, but it had looked like theft was at least part of the motive. So if Jack really had no enemies and his murder was not personal, then this being a robbery by a stranger, like a factory worker, was a definite possibility. McKeel knew that if Jack and Carol's home really had been robbed during this murder, then whoever did the robbery would likely try to unload the stolen goods quickly. And the easiest way to do that was to sell them to a local pawn shop. So, the day after Jack's murder, McKeel got a list of the items missing from Jack and Carol's home, which included several expensive watches, rings, and other pieces of jewelry, and contacted every pawn shop in the immediate area. But none of them claimed to have any of the missing jewelry yet, so McKeel left descriptions of the items along with their number. McKeel also contacted the City of Pittsburgh Pawn Division, which kept an extensive database of pawned items, and gave them descriptions of the stolen jewelry as well. It was sort of like she was fishing, and so McKeel knew she had to be patient. So, while she waited to hear back, she began looking into the workers from the Silver Star Meats Factory. Within a few days of the murder, McKeel led a team of officers to that factory. And as soon as she stepped out of her car, she could see that anybody standing right outside of the factory would have a clear view of Jack and Carol's front door and garage. From speaking to Carol, she knew Jack had been friendly with several factory employees, and on at least one occasion had invited them into his home. And so those types of visits would have been perfect opportunities to learn the layout of Jack and Carol's house and to figure out where they kept their valuables. Once inside the factory, McKeel and her officers began interviewing close to 40 workers, one by one. And pretty quickly, they identified the man who'd been invited by Jack into their home. His name was Ronald Blevins, and he had a criminal history of petty theft and assault. To McKeel, this was promising. But Blevins had not been at work on the day of Jack's murder because he was on a scheduled vacation. Now, McKeel did not think this made him any less of a suspect, but this early in the case, there wasn't any physical evidence to connect him to the crime, so she couldn't arrest him. As McKeel and her team left the meat factory, she felt a bit deflated. She really needed the forensics to come back if she was going to make any real progress on this case. Fortunately, though, there would be new evidence for her waiting back at the station. A copy of Jack's autopsy report was sitting on McKeel's desk. She opened it and began reading. And right away, she saw something important. Other than the gunshot wound, there were no bruises or scratches found anywhere on Jack's body. There was no sign of a struggle at all. And so McKeel knew this could mean that the killer broke into the house and then surprised Jack and shot him from behind, or it could mean Jack knew his killer and had let this person inside of his house. McKeel kept on reading the report, and as she got towards the end of it, her eyes went wide. The coroner had made a major discovery. A bullet had been extracted from Jack's skull, and they determined it came from a .380 caliber handgun. This was extremely helpful. McKeel still did not have the actual murder weapon, but now she knew what kind of gun she was looking for. and so she wanted to find out if somebody close to Jack, someone let's say he would have welcomed into his home, owned a gun like that. Over the next few days, Detective McKeel interviewed Jack's friends and family, and most of them echoed Carol's comments that Jack got along with everybody. And no one McKeel met with claimed to own a .380 caliber handgun. And so McKeel felt like she was quickly running into yet another dead end. That was until a few people mentioned a fight Jack had had with Carol's nephew at a Labor Day party. And also folks mentioned that one of Jack's nephews, so a different nephew, was looking to hash out a serious and urgent matter with his uncle in the days right before the murder. The people who mentioned those two nephews said that the nephews had been really close with Jack for most of their lives. But McKeel knew those relationships could have turned bad as soon as jewelry or money got involved. So she went to interview both men immediately. The first house she went to belonged to Carol's nephew, Michael LaPaya, the Army veteran who Jack and Carol had accused of stealing at their Labor Day party. When she began questioning Michael, he didn't deny that he and his uncle had a falling out. But he also insisted Jack was wrong about him stealing. More importantly, though, Michael denied having anything to do with Jack's death. He said he'd been busy on the day of the murder, at a doctor's appointment to treat his PTSD, and then he had also gone shopping with his girlfriend. And he showed McKeel receipts to prove it. And also, Michael did admit that he had lots of guns, and he knew how to use them after his time in the military. However, the one gun he didn't own was a .380 caliber handgun. After the interview, McKeel contacted the Veterans Affairs Medical Center and confirmed that Michael attended his appointment on the day of the murder. She was also able to verify that charges had been made on his credit card in a different city around the time of Jack's death. All in all, Michael's alibi seemed solid. So, Detective McKeel headed back to Jack and Carol's neighborhood to meet with the second nephew that Jack's friends and family had mentioned. This was Jack's nephew, Bradley, the one who lived on the same street and had been apparently wanting to speak with Jack in person about something serious and urgent. Now, from what other people had already told her, McKeel knew Bradley was mad at Jack for selling his mother's house, because Bradley thought the property should stay in the family. She also knew Bradley and Carol didn't really get along. To McKeel, this sounded like a pretty deep-rooted dispute, and she expected Bradley to be cagey when they spoke about it. However, once they sat down at Bradley's kitchen table, what Bradley actually said blew McKeel away. Right off the bat, Bradley said that at 10:30 a.m. on July 21st, which was the day of the murder, he'd waited until Carol had left for work and then walked over to Jack's house to confront him. Bradley said once Jack let him inside, he'd immediately asked Jack to halt the sale of his grandmother's house. Bradley was struggling financially and wanted to move into his grandmother's house with his girlfriend to save money. Bradley said Jack seemed open to the idea, but he refused to make a decision right then because he wanted to speak to Carol first. And at that point, Bradley knew he was not going to get the house, because he knew Carol would not like the idea and she would convince Jack to keep trying to sell the house. So Bradley told McKeel he'd just given up and left Jack's house sometime around 11:15 a.m., a little more than 3 hours before Carol would arrive home and find Jack dead. As Bradley finished up the story, McKeel was stunned silent. Bradley had just openly confessed to being inside of Jack's home, alone with him, on the day Jack died. And also, Bradley admitted that he had been there arguing over a property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But, amazingly, Bradley still wasn't done with his story. Just as McKeel was about to leave, he casually revealed one more fact. He told her that he did in fact own a .380 caliber handgun. McKeel confiscated Bradley's gun, then raced back to the station to have it analyzed by the ballistics lab to see if it was the murder weapon. It would take a while for the results to come in, but McKeel barely had to wait before she got another huge break in the case. That day, a member of McKeel's team told her he'd finally received a call back from a pawnshop owner in a nearby town. According to that owner, a young couple had come into their shop on July 21st, the day of Jack's murder. And this couple had wanted to sell a bunch of jewelry, including gold chains and rings. And the owner noticed that several of these pieces had been smashed and mangled, which made the owner suspect that these could be stolen. And so as a result, he had not purchased these pieces of jewelry, but he'd convinced the couple to let him take a few photos of the jewelry, and then after the couple left, he contacted the police in the area. And it had taken 3 days for those police to connect the incident to Jack's case and then get in touch with McKeel's team. But as soon as McKeel got this news, she went straight to the pawn shop to review the photos of the potentially stolen items. And when she saw these photos, there was no doubt that was Jack's jewelry. Now, this pawn shop did not have a security camera, so there was no footage of the couple who tried to sell Jack's stuff. But McKeel showed the pawn shop owner some photos of local criminals along with dozens of people of interest in Jack's murder case, which included Jack's nephew Bradley. And as these pictures were being shown, the owner suddenly stopped McKeel and pointed out one person in particular and said, "Yep, that's the man I saw." And to McKeel's surprise, it was not Bradley. The man the pawn shop owner picked out was named Brian Gibbons. He had a record of theft, and the police knew of him, but they hadn't remotely considered him as a suspect in Jack's murder because Brian had no known connections to Jack. But now, armed with this new information, McKeel left the pawn shop and headed to Brian's house. And as soon as Brian saw her, McKeel could tell she'd taken him by surprise. Brian denied having any knowledge of the murder, but when McKeel looked in his bedroom, it was absolutely littered with purses and jewelry. None of the items belonged to Jack or Carol, but a lot of the stuff had been reported stolen. This meant McKeel could charge Brian and hold him in custody while she looked for a connection to Jack's case. And so that's what McKeel did. She arrested Brian for theft. However, she still wasn't totally sure if he'd actually played a role in Jack's murder. McKeel had basically convinced herself that Jack's nephew, Bradley, was the killer. But now, Brian had come out of left field, and he seemed like an equally strong suspect. And so McKeel wondered if maybe these two men had worked together, with Bradley actually committing the crime and then passing off the jewelry to Brian to sell. But McKeel had no evidence that these two men even knew each other. And until the ballistics results came back, she didn't even know if Bradley's gun was the murder weapon. It was like suddenly McKeel had gone from having a case full of dead ends to having a case with too many good suspects. It would take another week before the final piece of evidence fell into place. On August 4th, 2 weeks after Jack's death, McKeel got a call about a second pawn shop, where a young man had stopped in the day after the murder trying to sell a bunch of damaged jewelry. Unlike at the first pawn shop, the employee at this one had not realized the jewelry was stolen, so he had bought it. Police had already examined the jewelry and confirmed it belonged to Jack. But the most important thing about this pawn shop was that it did have a security camera. And when McKeel watched that footage, she knew who killed Jack. That morning, the killer woke up in agony. They lay in bed for several minutes, drenched in sweat. Their cramps were getting worse. And beneath the pain, a horrible, clawing hunger was growing, demanding to be fed. From the next room, their partner shouted that they were heading off to work. At this, the killer scrambled up, yelling for their partner to wait. The killer dragged themselves out of bed and stumbled from the room. With a wild look on their face, they told their partner to call in sick today. They were going for a ride. A short while later, at about noon, the couple pulled up to the curb 1 block from the Silver Star Meats factory. The killer eyed the house directly across from the factory. The garage was open, and Jack's car was inside. He was home. The killer reached inside the glove box and took out a .380 caliber handgun. They told their partner to drive away if they weren't back in 30 minutes. Then they pocketed the gun, pulled the hood of their sweatshirt over their head, and got out of the car. The killer's heart pounded as they hurried down the sidewalk, avoiding eye contact with the meat factory employees, just standing about in their blood-stained aprons. The killer reached Jack's house, headed up the walkway, went through the front gate, and right to the door. They knocked and then waited. When no one answered, they urgently knocked again. The door opened. Jack looked out and quickly waved the killer inside. Jack turned away from the door and asked the killer if he could get them something to drink. But the killer didn't answer. Instead, they followed Jack through the doorway and into the front room, and there they stopped, drew the gun from their pocket, raised the barrel just inches from Jack's right ear, and fired. The bullet struck Jack in the back of the head. He fell, dead before he even touched the ground. And immediately, the killer bolted upstairs to the master bedroom, where they tore through the dresser, ripping out drawers and dumping the contents all over the floor. It didn't take long to find what they were looking for. They quickly dug through the room and found Carol's jewelry box and Jack's rings, chains, and watches. The killer stuck the items into the pockets of their sweatshirt, feeling a thrill of victory. Soon, that gnawing hunger would be satisfied. The pain would end. Then, the phone in the house began to ring, and the killer just froze. The killer listened as the call went to voicemail. Carol's voice echoed from the machine, asking why Jack wasn't picking up his cell phone, telling him that somebody was interested in buying his mother's house, and they needed to get there by 4 p.m. to open it up. Then Carol said she loved him and hung up. As soon as the voicemail ended, the killer rushed back downstairs to the front door. They grabbed the key off an end table to lock the deadbolt, but then something caught their eye. And once again, they froze. The killer saw Jack's feet jutting out from behind the coffee table. Beyond that, the killer saw the whole living room. It was a place with a lot of happy memories, where they, the killer, had spent countless slumber parties eating popcorn and watching movies with their cousins. A lump began to form in the killer's throat as they looked at a particular photo on the wall. Their 10-year-old self was smiling right back at them. The killer looked down at the floor, said goodbye to their Uncle Jack, and left. Jack's nephew, Bradley Johnson, had been high on Detective McKeel's suspect list. But when the results of the ballistics test on Bradley's .380 caliber handgun came back, it did not match the murder weapon. Also, at that second pawn shop where they had surveillance footage, it was not Bradley who McKeel saw, because Bradley didn't kill his uncle. Carol's nephew, the disgraced Army veteran Michael LaPaya, did. It would turn out Michael had been really struggling since his dishonorable discharge from the Army, even worse than some of his family knew. He'd started using heroin and begun stealing to support the habit. And as his addiction worsened, Michael became increasingly desperate for cash. And in July 2014, he saw a quick way to get it, by killing Uncle Jack and stealing his jewelry. Jewelry Michael pawned the next day for just a little over $1,000. Once Detective McKeel saw Michael on that pawn shop surveillance footage, she was sure she'd found Jack's killer. And soon after that, she dug into Michael's phone records and discovered that his phone had pinged off a cell phone tower near Jack's house around the time of the murder, not long before Michael had gone shopping with his girlfriend and to his medical appointment just to give himself an alibi. Eventually, Michael would confess to what he'd done. Michael was convicted of first-degree murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His girlfriend and alleged getaway driver was never charged. As for Brian Gibbons, the jewelry thief who Detective McKeel thought could be connected to this case, he was ultimately cleared of any involvement. The pawnshop owner who identified him had simply made a mistake. A man in his 40s was sitting in a cafe, munching on a ham and cheese sandwich for lunch. Now, usually, the man had more lavish lunches, but today he was in a hurry to get back to work, and this was all the cafe offered. But then, the most wonderful smell filled the air. The man inhaled deeply, enjoying the heavenly aroma of whatever this food was. It smelled like this incredible hot dish. He looked around to see which table the smell was coming from, but as he scanned the restaurant, all he saw were other patrons eating basically simple sandwiches just like him. And then he remembered this cafe didn't even serve hot meals. But at the same time, he realized he knew that scent from his childhood. It was the smell of the delicious Spanish fried eggs that his mother used to make, called huevos rotos. This was not the man's first phantom smell. A few weeks ago, his apartment had filled with the amazing aroma of his mother's cooking, completely out of nowhere. But now, in this cafe, just like that time in his apartment, the sweet smell suddenly turned sour. The man could taste something metallic in his mouth, and the foul odor of sour milk lingered in the air, making him gag. And so suddenly, a wave of panic crept over the man. He didn't know why he kept smelling things that weren't there. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, ask the follow button to go on a long hike with you, but before you go, superglue a tiny pebble inside one of their shoes. It's common wisdom that diet and exercise are the best ways to maintain your health. As they say, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But sometimes, no matter how fanatical you are about counting calories and getting daily exercise, there's just nothing you can do to keep certain illnesses at bay. And on this episode, we have two stories about extremely healthy people who find themselves fighting off strange, deadly conditions. The first story is about a marathon runner who suddenly goes through a drastic lifestyle change with no explanation. And the second and final story is about an active older woman who unexpectedly finds herself in the hospital, with doctors struggling to figure out what's wrong with her before it's too late. And now here's our first story called No Reservations. On a sunny morning in 1993, 42-year-old Roberto Nunez was on his daily run through his hometown of Granada, Spain. And as usual, along this route, he ran past delivery trucks parked outside of restaurants, and kitchen workers carried crates of food from these trucks into the back of the restaurants to prepare for the day's meals. Now, Roberto had never really paid these restaurants much attention. He was an athlete, and to him, food was just fuel, not some delicacy. But that morning, right after passing by the restaurant and smelling the smells of the food, he happened to run past a local bookshop. And for whatever reason, something in that bookshop caught his eye. It was a fine dining cookbook, beautifully displayed in the front window. And for some reason, Roberto stopped his run and just stared at this cookbook. Something about the meal on the cover just looked irresistible. He was so drawn to it, he could almost taste the food in his mouth. Moments later, Roberto found himself inside the bookstore, asking for a copy of that book. As the shopkeeper went to go get a copy of this book, Roberto wandered toward the culinary section of the store and began flipping through the other cookbooks. And by the time the shopkeeper returned, Roberto had a whole pile of them in his arms. When Roberto left the bookshop, he couldn't run anymore because of how heavy all these books were he'd just bought, and so he walked his way home. And then when he got home, he lined up all of his beautiful new cookbooks on his kitchen counter and just stared for a second, marveling at all the food on the covers. Then he went to his refrigerator to grab a container of yogurt, his usual breakfast. But now, as he stared down at the cup of plain, unflavored goop, his tongue seemed to recoil inside of his mouth. He felt like he could almost taste the plastic container and metal spoon before he even took a bite. Suddenly, Roberto's everyday breakfast seemed totally unappealing. And so for the first time in his entire adult life, Roberto decided to take himself out for breakfast. He walked to the nearest open cafe and read their extensive menu, and all the items sounded delicious. Unable to choose, he just asked the server to bring him the most popular dish and one of every side dish on the menu. 20 minutes later, Roberto's little cafe table was so full of plates, he could barely find a spot to set down his espresso mug. Roberto stuck his fork into a potato omelet seasoned with chives and garlic. He took a bite, and it felt like his tongue was exploding with pleasure. He'd had all these foods before, but they had never triggered a response like this. He felt a rush of joy as he leaned over his cafe table and devoured every bit of food his stomach could fit. A few weeks later, Roberto was pacing in his kitchen on the phone, making reservations at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Granada. For the past couple of weeks, he and his wife had been eating out for almost every meal. Roberto didn't know what had come over him. He'd never been a food person, but now he was spending nearly all his time researching the best restaurants in Granada and then making plans to dine at each of them. Meanwhile, his running shoes sat abandoned in his closet. In fact, he hadn't gone running even once this week. Roberto was a marathon runner, but his heart just was not in running anymore. He'd totally stopped counting calories and monitoring his carbohydrate and protein intake. His only long-term goal at the moment was a grand European road trip so he could try all the famous restaurants he'd been reading about. In fact, calling a travel agent was the next item on his to-do list. He intended to eat at every single Michelin-rated restaurant in the entire world. Roberto finalized another restaurant reservation and then hung up, marking the appointment on his calendar, and then he called the next restaurant on his list. 4 years later, Roberto sat at his computer typing up a restaurant review. By this point, his entire life now revolved around food. Every free second was spent eating, planning to eat, or traveling to the best restaurants all over the world so that he could write about them. Roberto looked a lot different now, too. Roberto had really not been running at all over the past few years, and between that and his sedentary lifestyle and new love of gourmet food, he'd gained a good 60 pounds. He'd had to buy a completely new wardrobe, but Roberto didn't mind. He'd actually never had so much fun in his life as he had now, being a foodie. The passion he now felt for food rivaled the sense of accomplishment he used to feel at the end of marathons. It was like he had finally found his real life's purpose. Roberto sat back in his home office chair and closed his eyes, trying to remember the subtlety of a glaze he'd tasted at lunch. He breathed in deeply, then sat up looking around. He breathed in again, and a warm, savory scent filled his nostrils. His entire apartment was suddenly filled with this heavenly aroma, even though he wasn't cooking anything at all. It took him a minute to place this wonderful smell, and then he had it. It was his mother's cooking, a spicy potato dish she used to make him when he was a kid. Confused, Roberto went to the kitchen, wondering if maybe his wife had come home and started making dinner without him noticing, but no, the kitchen was dark and empty. So Roberto wandered the house, running scenarios through his mind that might explain the smell. At first he thought, maybe a window was open and outside smells were coming in. But when that wasn't true, he began to wonder, did somebody break in and were they eating inside of his house? Now he knew that made no sense, but the more he wandered the house, the stronger the smell of his mother's cooking became, but there was no reason for it to be in his apartment. It just made no sense. Roberto was feeling freaked out, especially when, moments later, the smell changed from delicious to sour. He stopped and covered his nose as a chemical-like odor filled the apartment. But even with his nose covered, he could still smell it. Worse, he could taste it on his tongue. He gagged a little, then went to the kitchen to spit in the sink. He flung a window open, trying to air out the smell, and then as quickly as the smell had come on, it disappeared. Roberto stood in his living room feeling very unnerved, trying to tell himself that there had to be some rational explanation here. He told himself that it must have been a neighbor cooking a familiar recipe and accidentally burning it on the stove. But despite his best efforts to convince himself that that really happened, he still felt very unsettled as he went back to his computer to finish his review. A month later, Roberto was at a local cafe enjoying one of his favorite breakfasts, a potato and chorizo omelet with a side of fruit and some bread. He'd just finished slathering the bread with some butter when his nose caught a whiff of that same savory scent he had smelled inside of his apartment. The smell was his mother's cooking, specifically her huevos rotos, a traditional Spanish breakfast she used to make when he was a kid. Roberto looked around, wondering if the smell was coming from a neighboring table, but he was the only one with a plate of food. Roberto picked up his espresso and breathed in deeply, knowing the smell of coffee beans can clear your palate. But when he set the cup down again, that smell was still there. Roberto told himself not to panic, but he was worried. He decided that perhaps it was time to see a doctor about all these phantom smells. A few days later, Roberto was at a neurologist's office explaining how he was smelling all these things that weren't actually there, and he was concerned that he was losing his mind. Now, the neurologist didn't want Roberto to panic, but he did think Roberto might be experiencing smell hallucinations. And they're rare, but very real, and they can be the sign of something dangerous. The doctor explained that smell hallucinations can be caused by head injuries, upper respiratory infections, and in some cases, brain tumors or Parkinson's disease. Roberto did his best to stay calm. He didn't know what he'd been expecting when he got here today, but certainly not being told he could have a brain tumor or Parkinson's disease. The neurologist could clearly read the fear in Roberto's eyes because he immediately told him, don't worry, they'd run some tests and narrow down the possibilities, then figure out what was going on. They'd start by ordering an MRI. Roberto nodded, still feeling very uneasy. and a few hours later, his unease quickly turned to fear as the neurologist showed Roberto his MRI scan and pointed to a long, slender tumor on his right temporal lobe of his brain. Roberto felt petrified as the neurologist explained that the tumor was called a fibroblastic meningioma. It was putting pressure on Roberto's brain and causing him to have these smell hallucinations. The doctor explained that they'd have to surgically remove this tumor. Roberto felt a surge of adrenaline as he imagined himself undergoing brain surgery. He was going to be sick. He bent over, his arms on his knees, trying to catch his breath. And at the same time, the neurologist assured him that they would take very good care of him. The doctor said he would be with Roberto every step of the way. Roberto stood up and nodded. He knew he needed to call his wife and break the terrible news. But then after that, he would call his favorite restaurant to get takeout for dinner. He was in the mood for some comfort food. A few weeks later, Roberto was at home on his couch watching his favorite cooking show on TV. His head was still bandaged from his 14-hour brain surgery, which his neurologist said had been a success, and Roberto had been making slow but steady progress in his recovery. As he flipped through the channels, the mouth-watering smell of roasted chicken suddenly filled the room. And for a second, Roberto was terrified. Was this another smell hallucination? Did the surgery not work? But then he looked up and saw his wife enter the living room carrying 2 plates of roasted chicken, his dinner. His stomach rumbled, and he thanked his wife as she set his plate down on the coffee table and helped him sit upright. Roberto had not had a single smell hallucination since his surgery, and he was hoping that that meant he was cured. And so feeling like he had a new lease on life, Roberto looked forward to getting back to his food blog and the long list of restaurants he still wanted to try. 12 years later, on March 3, 2010, Roberto, who was now 58 years old, stood on the scale at his neurologist's office for a routine follow-up. Even though it had been over a decade since his brain surgery, he still had to get regular MRI scans to make sure there was no new tumors in his brain. The nurse took note of Roberto's weight. By this point, Roberto had gained approximately 110 pounds since he first took an interest in food. But this just didn't really bother him. He knew he'd been gaining weight steadily over the years, because after all, he ate rich and decadent foods for almost every meal, something he just loved to do. And besides, his career in food had really become quite incredible. Roberto was now a widely recognized and respected food critic. He wrote for prestigious magazines and gastronomy guides, and had been featured in a few newspapers. After that day's scan, Roberto waited inside of his neurologist's office, expecting the same results he got after every other appointment, all clear and good to go. Except this afternoon, his neurologist did not look too happy when he came through the door. He told Roberto that the MRI today showed a growing lesion and mild damage in the same areas where his tumor had been, and he believed that the lesion was likely left over from his surgery a decade ago. Roberto was shocked and asked the doctor if this meant more brain surgery. But the neurologist assured Roberto that this lesion was small. So small, in fact, they could very likely manage it without having to resort to surgery. Instead, they would do something called radiosurgery, which is when very focused beams of radiation are used to treat cancer cells in other tissue without any incision. Roberto liked the sound of that and scheduled the radiosurgery for later that week. A month later, Roberto parked his car along a street in Granada and adjusted his tie. Then he opened the passenger door for his wife, and the two of them began walking up the sidewalk on their way to a restaurant opening. And as they strolled along the boulevard, Roberto told his wife the good news. He'd had a follow-up doctor's appointment at his neurologist that afternoon. He'd completed his radiosurgery appointments at the start of the month, and now his neurologist told him that his lesion had shrunk by more than 25% and was no longer pressing on his temporal lobe. His neurologist felt optimistic that the lesion would soon be gone, and Roberto would be in full remission. As they neared the restaurant, Roberto's wife gave him a kiss and told him this was fantastic news. She was so relieved. Then the hostess led Roberto and his wife to their table and removed the shiny gold reserved placard as they sat down. The new restaurant was buzzing with anticipation. It was chock full of well-dressed diners, all clearly looking forward to an excellent night of food. A server came out to pour wine, and moments later, Roberto's first course was set down in front of him. But for some reason, it didn't look appetizing. He stared down at the food, trying to conjure some of the excitement he'd been feeling just moments ago, but he couldn't have been less interested. In fact, he kind of just wanted to leave and go home and get a good night's sleep. But Roberto was a professional, so he made himself eat every course they brought out to him. However, later that night, when he was working on the review, Roberto had to admit that his heart just wasn't in it. And so for the first time in more than 15 years, food just didn't really interest him. And the next time Roberto saw his neurologist, he learned why. It would turn out the tumor and lingering lesion pressing on Roberto's temporal lobe, known as the amygdala, was what had caused not only his hallucinatory smells, but his extreme interest in food. The pressure from the tumor created a brain injury, which in very rare cases can trigger a bizarre brain and eating disorder called Gourmand syndrome. People who suffer from this condition can literally become completely obsessed with fine dining. They become preoccupied with food and sometimes become compulsive eaters, even if they had formerly been very health conscious. And that's exactly what happened to Roberto. Once Roberto's tumor was removed and the lesion was finally reduced, Roberto's love for food basically completely faded. However, despite that, Roberto did not give up on his career. He kept working as a food critic, even if his job was not nearly as enjoyable as it was before. Hey, it's MrBallen. I'm excited to tell you about something special. For the first time, my show, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, has joined forces with Redacted, Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna, to tell a story so complex it required our combined storytelling styles. This special episode is called A Redacted Medical Mystery. In it, unexplained symptoms after a routine surgery quickly unravel into something much darker, leading straight to classified government operations hidden for decades. To listen and uncover the truth alongside us, head to either the MrBallen's Medical Mysteries or Redacted show pages right now. Or search for A Redacted Medical Mystery in the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're fascinated by unexplained medical stories, well, stick around on Medical Mysteries. Every week, we dive deep into cases that will leave you questioning everything you know about the human body. And if government conspiracies are more your style, Redacted is your go-to for stories that unravel secrets never meant to see the light of day. Remember, you can listen to both shows early and ad-free by joining Wondery Plus. Hey listeners, big news for true crime lovers. You can now enjoy this podcast ad-free on Amazon Music with your Prime membership. Listen to all episodes of my podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and MrBallen's Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, along with a huge collection of top true crime podcasts, completely ad-free. No more wading through cliffhangers or dealing with ads, because let's be honest, ads shouldn't be the most nerve-wracking part of true crime. To start your ad-free listening journey, download the Amazon Music app for free or head to amazon.com/ballen. That's amazon.com/BALLEN. Dive into uninterrupted true crime stories today. And now, here is our second and final story of today's episode, called The Bitter End. One morning in 2022, a 64-year-old woman named Beth shuffled into her kitchen in Ontario, Canada. It was early, and so Beth was still wearing her pajamas. She opened up her kitchen window to let fresh air blow inside, and as she did, she took in a deep breath and smiled. Beth always reminded herself not to take life's small pleasures, like a cool summer breeze, for granted. She grabbed a loaf of whole wheat bread off the counter and put 2 slices in the toaster. Then she opened her fridge and pulled out a container of green juice and a couple of organic eggs. Beth was extremely health and diet conscious and usually had this same breakfast every morning. She drank 2 glasses of juice while her toast cooked, and she scrambled her eggs. Then she sat at the kitchen table to eat. When she finished, she put her dishes in the sink and walked back to her room to get dressed for her morning jog. But as she was trying to decide what shirt to wear, Beth felt this dull pain in her lower abdomen. At first, she was able to ignore it, but then the pain got sharper and Beth suddenly was clutching her stomach. And then she felt weak, and a wave of nausea made her rush from her closet to her bathroom, where she vomited and then had diarrhea. Beth shakily walked to the sink and drank a few sips of water from the tap. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that her face was beet red. She could feel her heartbeat thudding in her throat, and so she brought 2 fingers up to her neck and began to count her pulse. And she found her heart was absolutely racing, and it really scared her because she had high blood pressure, and so she knew, at any point, something could go wrong with her heart. And so suddenly, Beth feared she might be having a heart attack. She stumbled back to her kitchen, she grabbed her landline phone off the counter, and she dialed 911. Less than half an hour later, Dr. Jacob Adams heard a siren blaring as an ambulance pulled up outside of the University of Ottawa's Montfort Hospital. A paramedic hopped out of the back of the vehicle and rushed into the emergency room, shouting to the doctor that, "Hey, we have a patient who's in shock here." And so Dr. Adams immediately ran with the paramedic out towards the ambulance, knowing he had a very sick patient on his hands. Shock occurs when a person doesn't have enough blood circulating throughout their body, and left untreated, it can rapidly lead to organ damage or even death. And this patient, Beth, was already in bad shape. The paramedic said that she was vomiting, she had diarrhea, and her blood pressure was dangerously high. Another paramedic followed closely behind the first, and together, they brought Beth into the emergency room on a gurney. Dr. Adams saw how pale and confused she looked, and knew there was no time to waste. He directed the EMT to wheel Beth into the nearest exam room, while the other paramedic briefed him on Beth's medical history. They told the doctor that Beth had been relatively healthy until today, but she had been taking medications for two conditions: high blood pressure and a thyroid deficiency that can leave patients feeling tired and looking pale. Otherwise, she was taking no other drugs. She didn't even take vitamins or over-the-counter supplements. The paramedic said Beth had deteriorated right before their eyes. When they first arrived at Beth's house, she was able to talk to them about her fear that she was maybe having a heart attack. But since then, she had gotten so much sicker that now she could barely talk. Dr. Adams nodded and thanked the paramedics for bringing her in. Then he watched as the ER nurses went to work on their very unstable patient. One nurse checked Beth's temperature, another inserted an IV needle, and a third wrapped a blood pressure monitor around her arm. At first, it showed that Beth's blood pressure was elevated, but suddenly, it plummeted 100 points. Beth's arms went limp, and she looked like she was struggling to breathe. And so within seconds, Beth's blood pressure had gone from being dangerously high to being so low that she could lose consciousness any second. Dr. Adams took one of Beth's hands and squeezed her fingers, making her skin turn white. He waited for the color where he squeezed to come back, but it took an unusually long time. To Dr. Adams, this was extremely worrying. It meant Beth's blood circulation had become dangerously sluggish. Before they could do anything else, Dr. Adams knew he would need to stabilize Beth's condition. He asked a nurse to start her on an IV fluid drip, and almost as soon as the fluids entered Beth's bloodstream, her blood pressure started rising and her breathing returned to normal. After a few minutes, Beth began to speak, albeit in a strained voice, saying that her stomach was killing her. She said she kept getting these horrible, sharp cramps in her lower abdomen. Dr. Adams assured Beth they would figure out what was going on, but they had to perform a lot of different tests as quickly as possible to do that. And so he told her the best thing she could do was try to stay calm and just focus on her breathing. Beth looked scared, but nodded her head in agreement. Then Dr. Adams called in 3 different medical technicians who all surrounded Beth. One of them took vials of her blood, another examined her abdomen with an ultrasound machine, while the third performed an EKG to test her heart function. Meanwhile, Dr. Adams stood off to the side and considered all of his patient's symptoms, and he began to think about a couple of different things that could have caused her to go into shock. Maybe she was having an allergic reaction, or maybe she swallowed some kind of poison, or maybe she was fighting a severe infection. Now, the first two, allergic reaction and poison, were tough to address right now, but the severe infection could be treated right away. So Dr. Adams called for a nurse to start Beth on broad-spectrum antibiotics, hoping this would stop a potential infection in its tracks. While a nurse gave Beth a dose of antibiotics through her IV tube, one of the medical technicians finished taking Beth's blood. Dr. Adams told him to have the blood tested for signs of infection, and also to run an emergency toxicology test to see if there were any traces of poison inside of Beth's body. At almost the same time, the ultrasound technician pulled up black and white images of Beth's digestive system onto a computer screen and told Dr. Adams that they didn't see anything out of the ordinary, like fluid buildup or a bowel obstruction. However, the technician who was doing the EKG had much more ominous news. They said the left side of Beth's heart was working much harder than it should have been, a sign that her heart was not functioning correctly. It could mean that the right side of her heart was failing, and so as a result, the left side was trying to make up for it, which Dr. Adams knew could easily put Beth's life in danger. But, alarming as the EKG results were, they didn't help Dr. Adams determine what was actually causing Beth's intense distress. He needed to get a better understanding of how all of her internal organs were functioning. So he decided to bring her into the radiology department for a CT scan, which would take pictures of the inside of her body. The scan only took about 15 minutes, but it revealed that Beth's problems went beyond her heart. Dr. Adams saw that her small intestine showed signs of inflammation or even a possible obstruction. Though the earlier ultrasound of her abdomen had looked normal, the doctor no longer believed that was accurate. He could tell from the more detailed CT scan that something was wrong after all. And suddenly, Dr. Adams had an alarming thought. Maybe Beth was bleeding internally inside of her digestive system. Severe internal bleeding could explain a lot of Beth's symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and her sudden drop in blood pressure. But this would be a terrifying diagnosis. If Dr. Adams didn't locate and stop the bleeding right away, Beth could bleed to death. A few minutes later, Dr. Adams received the results of Beth's blood work. Her toxicology report came back normal, meaning technicians had not found any poison in her system, but on the other hand, the results showed she did have elevated levels of a protein found in red blood cells, which did seem to indicate she did have internal bleeding. And just as the doctor set her test results aside, Beth's blood pressure suddenly plummeted again. She went pale and her breathing became labored. Dr. Adams looked up and noticed her IV fluid bag was empty, so he quickly replaced it with a full one, and as soon as the fluids flowed into her system, just like the last time, her blood pressure immediately stabilized. But to Dr. Adams, this was not a good sign. If Beth was rapidly bleeding internally, IV fluids would keep her going for a while, but eventually it would not be enough, and so she needed a blood transfusion as quickly as possible. And at this point, Beth looked sicker than ever. She groaned in pain and then leaned over the side of her hospital bed and vomited up blood. Now, Dr. Adams was certain that she was bleeding internally into her stomach, which was why she was throwing up the blood. He immediately called in a nurse, who began giving Beth a blood transfusion. He also continued giving her IV fluids and started her on drugs that would keep her blood pressure up and reduce acid in the stomach to hopefully slow the bleeding. After all that, Dr. Adams transferred Beth to the intensive care unit, where they met with a gastrointestinal specialist named Dr. Christina King. Dr. King said she needed to insert a tiny camera down Beth's throat and into her abdomen. That way, she could see firsthand where the blood was coming from. Dr. King turned to Beth, whose face was scrunched up in pain, and explained the procedure. Beth would be put under light anesthesia for about 30 minutes, and during that time, Dr. King would insert a tube with the camera on one end into Beth's esophagus and down into her stomach. Beth looked uneasy, but she was so sick that a tube going down her throat seemed like a small price to pay for some answers. She said okay, and the doctors got to work prepping her for the procedure. About 15 minutes later, Beth had been put under anesthesia and was lying on her side on a bed in her ICU room. Dr. King stood beside her and carefully inserted the long, thin tube down her throat. Dr. King could see the inside of Beth's esophagus on a screen right beside her bed. Dr. King moved the tube further down Beth's digestive system, and as soon as the camera entered Beth's stomach, Dr. King saw that her stomach lining was swollen, red, and bleeding. The bleeding was not severe, but the doctor knew that was only thanks to the drugs that Dr. Adams had given Beth. Later that afternoon, Dr. King sat in the ICU with Beth, who was still sedated from her procedure. Beth did look much better than she had just a few hours ago, and Dr. King was glad that the treatment she and Dr. Adams had come up with seemed to be working. Her internal bleeding had largely stopped, at least for now, and so for the time being, Dr. King could really focus on why Beth was bleeding internally. Dr. King was starting to think that Beth's illness had been caused by something that she might have eaten rather than by poison or an infection. And so once Beth woke up from her procedure, Dr. King asked her if she'd eaten anything out of the ordinary that morning before she'd gotten sick. Beth initially said no. She'd had the same breakfast she ate every single morning: whole wheat toast, organic eggs, and homemade green juice. However, Beth said, now that she thought about it, her juice had tasted a bit more bitter than usual. Dr. King asked what kind of juice it was, and Beth said, she made it herself from a type of green squash called bottle gourds that she had bought at the store. She'd heard that bottle gourds were a really great health food, and so for the last several years, she'd been pureeing the vegetables into a juice that she would drink every morning. Dr. King just stared at Beth, because suddenly she knew what was going on with Beth, and it made perfect sense. Beth had given herself a nearly fatal case of toxic squash syndrome. It's a very rare condition that results from eating poisonous chemicals sometimes found in squashes and gourds. These toxins are called cucurbitacins, and they taste very bitter. Over hundreds of years, people have bred squashes to have only trace levels of these toxins. But sometimes the plants can still develop high amounts of cucurbitacins as they grow, and people who eat a lot of those types of vegetables can get dangerously ill. Beth went to her local grocery store and unknowingly bought bottle gourds that did contain a dangerous amount of these toxins. Then she pureed the vegetables and drank the juice, and the only thing she noticed was a slightly bitter taste, until just minutes after breakfast, the toxins caused her stomach lining to start bleeding, and Beth went into shock. Her case was the first of its kind ever reported in Canada. After 5 days in the ICU, Beth was finally healthy enough to return home. 2 weeks later, her doctors called to check on her condition, and she told them that she was feeling fine, except for one symptom. In the past few days, her hair had begun falling out. Her doctors told her that this was actually normal. Delayed onset hair loss had been reported in a number of cases of toxic squash syndrome. Despite her hair loss, which was actually only temporary, Beth would go on to make a full recovery and go back to her normal life, though she found another kind of juice to drink at breakfast.
On the night of April 7, 2014, 32-year-old Robin Spielbower tucked her 10-year-old daughter into bed in their house in Amarillo, Texas. Robin told her daughter that she loved her, said goodnight, and then walked out of the room. Robin could hear the TV on in the front room of the house, and she began heading that way, but before she got there, she stopped to look in on her younger daughter. Robin peeked into her bedroom and saw the little girl was already fast asleep. And as soon as she saw this, Robin just felt this complete sense of calm come over her. As a single mother with 2 young kids, Robin's days could get busy and chaotic. But she was finally able to relax each night when she knew her daughters were safe and sound in their beds like they were right now. Robin left the bedroom and walked down the hall into the front room of the house, where she found her mom and dad watching TV. Robin took a seat on the couch with her parents, grabbed her phone out of her jeans pocket, and quickly sent a text message. Robin's mom looked over and asked her daughter if everything was okay. She was fine, just making some plans. Robin knew her parents loved having her and the 2 girls in the house, and they played a huge part in helping her take care of the kids. But Robin thought in a perfect world, she would not be living with her parents in her early 30s. Because for many years before she wound up back at her parents' house, Robin had been living a life she loved on her own. When she was 22, she had fallen in love with a great guy named J.D. Spielbower. J.D. was a former United States Marine and had served in Afghanistan and Iraq. Robin's father had been in the military most of his life, and so her parents had been really happy when Robin started dating a military veteran. Robin got pregnant just 2 months after they started dating, and so she and J.D. had their first daughter, then got married, and then they had their second daughter a few years later. And for Robin, ever since she was young, all she had wanted was to be a mom. And so she didn't really care that she and J.D. struggled with money sometimes, or that raising kids really wasn't always easy. She and her husband loved each other, and they had these 2 beautiful girls. That was more than enough to be grateful for. But in 2012, after she and J.D. had been together for almost 10 years, everything began to change. J.D. became distant, and he started spending a lot of time away from home. And not long after that, Robin had discovered that J.D. was cheating on her with a woman named Katie Phipps, who just happened to be one of Robin's friends from church. After Robin had learned that her husband and friend were having this affair, she divorced J.D., took the kids, and moved back in with her parents. And not long after that, J.D. had married Katie Phipps, which really only added to the tension. Back on the couch, Robin's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down at the text, smiled, and got up. She told her parents she would have to run out for a bit and asked if they could watch the kids while she was gone. Her mom said of course, and then asked if Robin was going out to meet her new boyfriend. Robin blushed a little, but didn't respond. Then she just grabbed her purse, told her parents she wouldn't be gone too long, and walked out the front door. A few minutes later, at about 9:30 p.m.,
Robin drove her black Chevy Tahoe out of town and turned onto Helium Road, which was a long, winding dirt road surrounded by farmland on both sides. As she drove, Robin cranked up the country music on the radio and looked out at the huge Texas night sky. The only light on the road came from her headlights and the moon, and this made Robin feel like she was out in the middle of nowhere. But that was perfect as far as she was concerned. In fact, that's why she'd chosen Helium Road for this meeting in the first place. She didn't want anyone to see what she was about to do. Eventually, Robin pulled her SUV over to the side of the road, put it in park, and began to wait. And as she did, she listened to the radio and looked out the window. And then eventually, she saw headlights coming down the road behind her. The following day, at noon, almost 15 hours after Robin had left her house, a middle-aged man drove his truck down Helium Road. The sun was bright, and it was about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It looked and felt like a perfect spring day. As the man was driving, he spotted something in the distance, so he slowed down and squinted. And he was surprised by what he saw. 3 young girls were running down the road right towards him, and they were screaming. This part of Helium Road was usually pretty deserted, and it wasn't really a place where kids played. So the man immediately hit his brakes, put his truck in park, and stepped outside to see what was going on. He walked over to the girls and asked if they were okay. And without breaking their stride, all 3 girls pointed behind them and started yelling, "She's dead! She's dead!" The man looked where the girls were pointing, and he saw there was a black SUV parked on the side of the road. He told the girls to stay where they were, and then he ran over to the SUV. And when he got there, at first glance, it just looked like somebody had abandoned the vehicle. However, when he walked to the passenger side of the SUV and looked at the ground, he just froze. The man was in total shock at what he saw, and it horrified him that 3 young kids were clearly the first ones to have stumbled onto the scene. The man took a breath and steadied himself, then he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. A little later that afternoon, Sergeant Alan Mongold of the Randall County Sheriff's Department sped down Helium Road. Up ahead, he saw there was an ambulance, cop cars, and a fire truck, and then behind him, driving as well, were more police cars. Sergeant Mongold could not think of a time ever when this spot on Helium Road, basically in the middle of all this farmland, had been so crowded. He eventually pulled over and parked his car not far from a black SUV and got out. And immediately, an officer ran over to meet him and said he'd taken statements from the 3 young girls and the man who had been there when he arrived, but he'd arranged for the girls to be taken home, and he'd sent that man on his way. Mongold said that was fine. He would follow up with them if he needed to. And then he and the other officer walked around to the passenger side of this black SUV, and they joined a group of paramedics who were already standing there. But as soon as Mongold looked at the ground just outside the car, it was clear the paramedics could not do anything. Because lying there on the ground was a woman's body. And based on all the bugs crawling on her, Mongold knew she must have been dead for at least several hours. Mongold put on his gloves and crouched down next to the body. The woman was on her back, and immediately Mongold saw a deep dark bruise on the left side of her head. And at first glance, this bruise did not appear to be something she got just from falling down or something. It looked like something had been smashed into the side of her head, like a heavy object. And so at this point, Mongold felt confident he was very likely dealing with a murder. He reached into the woman's pockets, but found they were empty. So he told one of the officers on hand to run the plates of the SUV. And then he and the others started to do a sweep of the area. Within minutes, Mongold saw the officer who had just run the plates waving him over. Mongold joined him, and the officer said that the SUV was registered to a woman whose name was Robin Spielbower, and the image of Robin Spielbower that popped up matched the victim. Pretty soon, members of the county's forensics team arrived, and Sergeant Mongold searched the area around Robin's body and her SUV again. And this time, a forensic tech saw something that seemed really strange. The back windshield of Robin's SUV had a small crack in it, and embedded in the crack were tiny pieces of hot pink plastic. Now, neither the forensics tech nor Sergeant Mongold had any idea what this pink plastic was from. But the tech said hopefully that would become clear after they ran some tests. The investigative team spent hours searching up and down Helium Road, hoping to find a potential murder weapon or maybe Robin's cell phone. But other than those pink plastic flecks on the SUV windshield, there really wasn't much to go on. Mongold considered the possibility that this could have been a robbery gone wrong, that someone had gotten Robin to stop her car, attacked her, and had stolen her purse and her phone. But the idea that a carjacker would choose this road to try to rob someone where there wasn't a whole lot of traffic just didn't make a lot of sense to him. And so Mongold couldn't help but think that maybe Robin's killer was someone she knew. The following morning, April 9th, Sergeant Mongold sat at his desk reviewing the autopsy report. The report stated that Robin had most likely died the night before her body was found, and that her body had just laid outdoors on the side of the road overnight. And even more importantly, the autopsy report confirmed that Robin had been murdered. Because in addition to the blunt force trauma wound that Mongold had found on the side of her head, the medical examiner had also discovered a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber pistol in the back of Robin's head. So, that morning, Sergeant Mongold went to meet with Robin's friends and family to learn as much as he could about her, and also to see if anyone close to Robin owned a .22. Mongold had informed Robin's parents about the death of their daughter the previous night, and even without the results of the autopsy report, he had told them he believed there had been foul play. And so through their complete shock and grief, Robin's parents had given Mongold a list of the few people who had been closest to Robin. And now, Mongold decided to start with her new boyfriend, a bartender named Jared. But the conversation with Jared proved to be pretty uneventful. Jared said he'd been working at the bar the night that Robin had died. He said she hadn't called him or texted him or anything. And Mongold was able to quickly track down multiple people at the bar who corroborated Jared's alibi. Now, the detective had no intention of crossing Jared off his list this early on, but Jared did not jump out as an obvious suspect. And so Mongold figured if Robin's current boyfriend didn't look like a major suspect, well, the next logical step was to talk to her ex-husband, J.D. Spielbower. Later that day, now over 24 hours after Robin's body had been found, Sergeant Mongold knocked on the front door of J.D.'s house. And as he knocked, Mongold felt a bit surprised by where he was standing, because J.D. lived only a few houses away from Robin's parents' house. The door opened, and a woman who looked like she was in her late 20s with long brown hair and bright blue eyes was standing there. Mongold introduced himself, and the woman said her name was Katie, and that she was J.D.'s wife. She said news had traveled fast, so she already knew about the murder, and she assumed that's why Mongold was here, to talk about it. Mongold nodded, but before he could say much more, a tall, thin man with a cropped military-style haircut stepped outside. He introduced himself as J.D. Spielbower. But immediately, his wife, Katie, snapped at him and told him to shut up, because she was talking to the police. J.D. immediately hung his head and fell silent. Sergeant Mongold acted like he didn't notice any of that, but in reality, he was taken aback. Married couples, even ones that didn't necessarily get along, rarely lashed out at each other in front of him, especially when they knew they could be potential suspects in a murder case. But Mongold remained calm and polite and asked them where they'd been the night that Robin died. Katie said that she and her son had been at a friend's house, and they had come home around 10 p.m. J.D. said he'd been home all night with his uncle, who also lived in the house. They'd just been drinking beer and playing some pool. Other than Katie's quick outburst at J.D., nothing the couple did after that seemed particularly strange. However, for some reason, Mongold just felt like there was a good chance both of these people were lying to his face. He talked to them for a bit longer, and then as they wrapped up, he told them he would be in touch if he needed any more information. But as he walked back to his car, Mongold already knew he'd be calling J.D. and Katie down to the station soon. He just needed to be better prepared if he was really going to interview them. After leaving J.D. and Katie's house, Mongold drove a few minutes across town to Robin's best friend Aaron's house. Robin's parents had told Mongold that Robin and Aaron were extremely close and shared basically everything with each other. So Mongold thought she'd be a great person to talk to learn more about Robin, but also he figured if anybody had inside information on Robin's ex-husband and his new wife, it might be Aaron. And as it would turn out, Aaron knew a whole lot about Robin's ex and his new wife. She told him that at one point, she, Robin, JD, and Katie had all been friends. But then JD and Katie had an affair and things got ugly. She said Robin constantly worried about the kids and wondered if she and JD should really be trying to co-parent them. Aaron also said that JD talked a lot about suffering from PTSD because of his time in combat as a Marine. Mongold took notes on everything Aaron was telling him. An affair, a divorce, and a potential custody battle could all be motives for murder. And while Mongold did not believe that all military vets suffering from PTSD were inherently violent, JD's condition was still something he had to consider. But Aaron would tell Mongold something else that would instantly make him rethink his entire approach to JD and Katie. Aaron said late last year, Robin had gone over to JD and Katie's house to drop off the kids. However, when Katie had come in and seen her husband and Robin talking, she screamed, grabbed Robin, slammed her into the fireplace, and threatened to ruin her life. That evening, Sergeant Mongold led JD into an interview room at the sheriff's station, and then he sat down next to him at a small round table that was pushed up against the wall. JD was wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap that he kept messing with like he was nervous. Mongold had spent most of the previous night trying to learn as much as possible about Robin, JD, and Katie's relationship, and he had worked with the phone company to secure a copy of text messages sent to and from Robin's cell phone. Mongold started the interview by asking JD to give him an overview of what he'd been doing on the night Robin died. JD spoke in a slow Texas drawl. He was polite and addressed Mongold as Sir, and he said basically the same thing he'd told Mongold when they met at the house. He'd been hanging out with his uncle at home, drinking and shooting pool. Mongold nodded and asked if he'd seen Robin at all on that day. But JD shook his head and said he had not seen or talked to her. Sergeant Mongold reached down and grabbed a file folder out of a briefcase. He opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. Then he turned to JD and said he wanted to help him because clearly JD was having trouble remembering things clearly. Mongold told JD that this piece of paper was a record of all the text messages Robin had sent and received on the night she died. And her final text exchange was with JD, just before 9:30 p.m. And it was clear from this text that the two of them had been planning to meet up that night. JD immediately took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair. He apologized for lying, and then as he tried to explain himself, he started to stammer. Finally, he got out that Robin was supposed to meet him that night at his house to talk about a standardized test their older daughter was supposed to take. However, JD said Robin never showed up. At this point, Mongold really began to press JD. He asked him if Robin had never showed up, why hadn't he reached out to her? And JD really struggled to come up with an answer. He remained polite and kept calling Mongold Sir, but as he was doing that, Mongold got the impression that this was not a man who planned things out, or who could easily organize his thoughts. And so eventually, Mongold told JD that he could assume only one of two things. JD had lied because he was the one who murdered Robin, or he had lied to cover for someone else. JD just shook his head and said he would never hurt Robin. But Mongold snapped back and said, well, if you didn't kill her, who did? JD went quiet for a second, and then he looked up at Mongold and just said, I have suspicions. Now, during this interview, JD did not come out and actually say who he suspected, but Mongold thought it was pretty clear. In fact, Mongold had the same suspicion since he talked to Robin's friend Aaron. So Mongold didn't waste any time. He let JD go, and then had JD's wife, Katie, brought to the station and into the same small interview room. Katie was wearing a sweatshirt with a pink camouflage pattern on it, and while her husband, JD, had looked very nervous when he came in, Katie, on the other hand, just looked mad. But before Sergeant Mongold could even ask her a question, she said she needed him, Mongold, to tell her something. She said she needed to know if JD was having an affair with his ex-wife Robin. Mongold said he didn't know if that was the case, but he did know that JD and Robin had planned to see each other on the night that Robin died. After hearing this, Katie broke down sobbing and put her face in her hands. She said she knew it. She knew Robin had been trying to tear her marriage apart because Robin had never gotten over JD after the divorce. But despite all the obvious anger Katie felt towards Robin, she insisted that she had nothing to do with Robin's murder. However, despite what Katie and JD said during their interviews, Sergeant Mongold still decided to secure search warrants for their house and their cell phones, and he felt sure he would soon be able to arrest one or both of them. On April 10th, so just 3 days after Robin's murder, Sergeant Mongold and the investigative team searched JD and Katie's house, and they quickly found a room filled with guns. Mongold didn't think that was strange, though. Amarillo, Texas was home to a lot of avid hunters, and most of the weapons in this room were hunting rifles. But one gun immediately caught the detective's eye. Sitting in an open case was a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol. Now, Robin had been shot with a .22. But that was not actually the only thing that made this gun stand out. This gun had hot pink plastic accents on part of the grip and the barrel. And when Mongold leaned down to get a better look, he noticed that part of the pink plastic on the grip was cracked, and that small pieces of the plastic appeared to be missing. And so right away, Mongold assumed that those small pieces of pink plastic that were missing must have wound up embedded in the back windshield of Robin's SUV. Investigators quickly found out that the gun was registered to Katie, and they even found photos she had posted on social media of her holding that gun. And later that day, when police searched Katie's text messages, they found something just as damning. In the 4 days leading up to the murder, Katie had sent 336 text messages to JD, threatening to ruin him and Robin. And the final text message, number 336, which Katie had sent to JD about an hour before Robin had left her parents' house and driven out to Helium Road, said, "You started this whether you want to believe it or not. I will finish it." The Randall County Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office moved fast. On April 11th, 4 days after Robin's murder, they arrested Katie. However, before the case could go to trial, the DA wanted either a confession or clear evidence that demonstrated Katie had been driving on Helium Road on the night of the murder. Katie refused to confess. She just repeated her story that she had been with her son at a friend's house and then gone home at around 10 p.m. that night. Now, Katie's cell phone had pinged off a tower near the murder site at the time Robin was most likely killed, but that tower also would have pinged if she was driving from her friend's house to her house, so it was not the definitive evidence the DA was looking for. The search for some elusive piece of evidence that would ensure a guilty verdict began to frustrate the police. After all, Sergeant Mongold and his team had Katie's gun and her threatening text messages to JD, and they knew Katie had once slammed Robin into a fireplace. But Mongold and his team's hands were tied, because the DA's office had taken over the investigation. The DA's office wound up re-interviewing people connected to the case and also scouring surveillance footage from locations just outside of town to see if they could spot Katie's car pulling onto Helium Road. But none of this led to anything new, and the investigation dragged on for months. And so the DA began to worry that he would never find this piece of evidence that would definitively win over a jury. But on a day in July of 2015, over 15 months after Robin's murder, a woman who worked for the DA rushed into his office, and she had a very excited look on her face. She told the DA that she'd seen a story on the news about how certain cell phones left a clear digital footprint when they were connected to Wi-Fi. Essentially, police could use this Wi-Fi data to track exactly where a phone had been, which was far more information than a cell phone tower could provide. When the DA heard this, his face lit up. He'd never heard about this type of search. So he gathered his team, and they immediately got in contact with the phone and internet companies, and soon they were able to trace Katie's exact path on the night of the murder. This was exactly the kind of evidence the DA had been looking for. And not long after that, the DA got another big break when he was contacted by Robin Spielbower's mom. She told him that she had just gotten this very bizarre phone call that she knew would help his investigation. And the information Robin's mom provided, along with the newly collected Wi-Fi data, finally solidified the case. That night, the killer drove their truck through town, trailing just far enough behind Robin so as not to be spotted. The city lights slowly disappeared behind them as the killer followed Robin out onto a dark dirt road. And after a few more minutes of driving, the killer saw Robin pull over and park. And so the killer slowed down as well and parked right behind her. Once they were stopped, the killer put on a pair of gloves, grabbed a gun from the passenger seat, and then stepped outside, leaving their headlights on. The killer calmly walked towards the SUV, raised their gun, and slammed it against Robin's back windshield. The windshield cracked, and the killer heard Robin begin to scream from inside the vehicle. The driver's side door of the SUV suddenly flew open, and Robin lunged out of the car and started screaming at the killer. But the killer just raised their gun. Robin saw the gun in the headlights from the truck, and she ran towards the farmland that surrounded the road, trying to get away, but the killer followed, and they aimed at Robin in the low light, and they fired. The bullet struck Robin in the back of the head. She stumbled, her body twisted, and she fell to the ground on her back. The killer approached and saw Robin was still breathing, so they aimed the gun at her forehead and pulled the trigger again. But the gun jammed. The killer panicked. They rushed back to their truck, glancing over their shoulder to make sure Robin was not getting up and running off. The killer found a tire iron from the truck bed, took it, and ran back to the side of the road where Robin was still laying on the ground. The killer held up the tire iron and swung it hard into the side of Robin's head. Blood spilled from Robin's temple out onto the ground. Now she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the side of the road. The killer leaned down and took Robin's cell phone out of her pocket. They searched her other pocket for personal items, but she didn't have anything else on her. So the killer walked over to her SUV, leaned inside through the open driver's side door, and grabbed Robin's purse. And then with that in hand, they shut the door behind them. The killer ran back to their truck, hopped in the driver's seat, and sped off down the dirt road back towards their house in town. Once back inside the safety of their home, the killer walked right into their gunroom, and they would put the gun they had just used to shoot Robin, a Sig Sauer .22 caliber pistol with a pink plastic grip, into an open gun case. At this point, the killer took a deep breath and began to calm down. They were convinced the police would eventually find this pink gun. And when they did, they would believe Katie had murdered Robin. Katie Phipps would stay in prison for over a year awaiting trial, while the DA's office tried to find evidence that would ensure her conviction in court. But Katie didn't murder Robin. Her husband, JD, did. It would turn out that Katie's suspicions about JD and Robin had been correct. JD, who had cheated on Robin with Katie, had now begun cheating on Katie with Robin. But JD knew Katie had caught on, and the whole thing had now turned into a total mess. He wanted both women out of his life, so he murdered his ex-wife and framed his current wife for the crime. On the night of the murder, the way JD had lured Robin to Helium Road was he had been texting back and forth with her to set up a meeting on that secluded road. That way they could carry on their affair without being seen. Police had considered JD a suspect, but the bulk of the evidence they found seemed to point to his wife Katie. She had sent hundreds of threatening text messages, had physically assaulted Robin, and had claimed she was going to, quote, finish what JD had inadvertently started. And when tests were run on Katie's gun, the pink plastic from the weapon matched the pink plastic police had found embedded in Robin's back windshield. And so, after only a 4-day investigation, police had arrested and jailed Katie. But over a year later, as investigators and the DA tried to shore up their case before going to court, new evidence came to light. Katie's phone had not been connected to Wi-Fi on the night of her murder. However, her son's phone had. And so using the Wi-Fi data from her son's phone, in connection with cell phone tower from Katie's phone, police were able to see that on the night of the murder, Katie's route was directly from her friend's house back to her own house. At that point, they realized Katie had been telling the truth. She did not kill Robin. Also, investigators came to believe that many of Katie's threatening text messages to JD might have been about divorcing him and exposing his affair, not about harming Robin. So with this new evidence, police released Katie from jail, and the DA admitted he had rushed to judgment about her guilt. Once Katie was out, investigators quickly turned their attention to JD. And one of the first things they discovered was that JD's stories about suffering from PTSD were a complete lie. Because JD had never served in the military. It was just something he lied about to impress women. And so the fact he had successfully carried out this lie for years and had even convinced police it was true helped lead the investigators to believe that JD was much craftier than they had given him credit for. They came to assume that everything he'd told them during the investigation was potentially a lie, and that he had the personality and the mental capacity to frame someone else for murder. And then finally, when investigators really began to move in on JD, Robin's mom contacted the DA about this bizarre phone call she got. She said that JD had called her and asked her to lend him a significant amount of money so that he could take his daughters on a trip to New York ASAP. With everything else investigators had learned, they saw this as a huge red flag. They believed the reason JD was trying to go to New York was actually just to make a run for the Canadian border. So they arrested JD before he could leave town, and they charged him with the murder of his ex-wife Robin. JD was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He'll have a chance for parole in 2046. Despite the conviction, some members of the sheriff's department continued to believe that Katie had played a role in this crime. But once she was released from jail, Katie was never arrested or charged again in connection with Robin's murder.